The dog smelled it before anyone else knew to look. A 110-pound Belgian Malinois pressed flat against the hospital floor, ears pinned, eyes locked on a ventilation panel 12 feet above the trauma ward hallway. The injured Navy SEAL in the room behind it hadn't moved in 4 hours. The nurse standing in the doorway, the one nobody ever paid attention to, the one the director had personally sent to kick both of them out, she saw the dog's posture, and something cold and old moved through her chest like a key turning in a lock she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. She'd seen that alert before. Not in any hospital. In Kandahar. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who believes the people most overlooked are often the most dangerous, this story was made for you. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will hit you somewhere you didn't expect. Hit like if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Maple Crest General Hospital sat at the edge of Harlow, Colorado, like an afterthought, functional, underfunded, and perpetually understaffed. It wasn't a prestigious research facility or a gleaming urban trauma center. It was the kind of hospital that handled drunk driving accidents on Saturday nights and frostbite cases in February and the occasional overdose from the trailer parks north of the interstate. The kind of place where people came because they had no better option, and the staff stayed because they were either too tired to leave or too stubborn to quit. Nurse Mara Donovan was both. She had worked the trauma floor at Maple Crest for just under 3 years. She arrived every shift 11 minutes early, kept her station immaculate, never called in sick, and never gave the charge nurses any reason to notice her. She was 34 years old with dark circles under her eyes that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with the kind of alertness that never fully shuts off. She wore her brown hair pulled back tight, kept her scrubs plain, and answered every question with the minimum number of words required. Nobody asked her much about her past. She'd given them nothing to ask about. The hospital director, Gerald Strom, had been running Maple Crest for 6 years on a management philosophy that could be summarized in 3 words: control, budget, optics. He was a thick-necked man in his mid-50s who wore the same Navy suit every Monday and kept a photo of himself shaking hands with the state governor on the wall behind his desk. He wasn't cruel, exactly. He was the kind of man who mistook compliance for loyalty and silence for agreement, and he had a particular talent for identifying the employees least likely to push back. Mara Donovan was his favorite example. She never pushed back. She did what she was told. When he'd reassigned her from the surgical recovery ward to trauma without a raise or an explanation, she'd simply nodded and moved her locker. When he'd cut the trauma floor's supply budget and forced the nurses to ration wound dressings, she'd said nothing. She was, in Gerald Strom's professional estimation, exactly the kind of employee that kept an underfunded hospital running, invisible, compliant, and cheap. Which was precisely why, on a gray Thursday morning in early November, he called her into his office and gave her the job nobody else wanted. "Room 11, he said, not looking up from his desk. "The military patient. Hayes." Mara stood in the doorway. Captain Hayes was admitted 2 days ago with a compound fracture of the left tibia and soft tissue damage to the knee. He's stable but not ambulatory. "I know what his chart says, Donovan. I need you to speak with him about the dog." She waited. Strom finally looked up. "The animal control situation. His handler animal, whatever they call it. The thing has been in that room since he arrived, and I've had 3 complaints from the nursing staff about the smell, and 1 from a family member on the floor who claims their child is frightened." He set down his pen. "The dog needs to go. I've already arranged for it to be transferred to the VA facility in Fort Renner. Captain Hayes is still in acute recovery. Removing his service animal without his agreement could—" "I'm not asking for his agreement, Donovan. I'm informing him." Strom's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "That's why I'm sending you. You don't make scenes. You explain the hospital's position, you hand him the transfer paperwork, and you leave." She looked at him for a moment, just a moment. "I'll take care of it," she said. She walked out of his office, down the corridor, past the nurses' station where 2 of her colleagues were laughing about something on a phone screen, and she pushed through the stairwell door and stood in the fluorescent quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then she went to do her job. Room 11 was at the far end of the trauma wing, separated from the other patient rooms by a set of double doors that the staff had informally started keeping propped open because the hydraulic arm was broken and nobody had submitted the repair request yet. It was a slightly larger room than the others, not by design but by accident, a result of a renovation 15 years ago that had knocked out a non-load-bearing wall and never been corrected. The extra space was the reason they'd put Hayes in there. The dog needed room. Mara stopped outside the door. She could hear the animal before she saw it. A low, rhythmic sound, not quite panting, more like the dog was cycling through different levels of awareness. She'd known dogs that made that sound. Not pets. Working dogs. The ones trained to read a room the way a soldier reads a ridgeline. She knocked twice and pushed the door open. Captain Declan Hayes was propped against two pillows with his left leg elevated in a foam brace, an IV drip running into his right arm, and the particular expression of a man who had been stuck in a bed against his will for 48 hours, and was managing his frustration with the careful, deliberate effort of someone who knew what happened when he didn't. He was 38, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once, and the kind of shoulders that made the hospital gown look inadequate. His chart said he'd been brought in from a training exercise that had gone wrong in ways the referral paperwork described only as mechanical failure during field operation. Nobody on the floor had pushed for more detail. Beside his bed, sitting perfectly still on the floor with his lead looped around the bed rail, was the dog. Rex, it said so on the tactical vest folded on the chair in the corner, was a Belgian Malinois, maybe 4 years old, with a dark muzzle and amber eyes that tracked Mara the instant she came through the door. He didn't growl, didn't move, just watched her with the steady, calibrated attention of an animal that had been trained to assess threats and file them accordingly. He filed her. Hayes looked at her with the same quality of attention, minus the amber eyes. Nurse. Captain Hayes. She moved to the side of the bed, not close enough to crowd him, not far enough to seem formal. I'm Mara Donovan. I'm on the trauma floor team. How's the pain level this morning? Manageable. He paused. You're not here about the pain level. No, she said. I'm not. She told him cleanly. The hospital's position, the complaints, the transfer paperwork for Rex. She didn't editorialize. She didn't apologize. She gave him the facts in the order they were relevant and let him hear them without noise around them. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished. Rex is not a service animal in the therapeutic sense, Hayes said. He's a military working dog. He's been with me through 3 deployments. He has a handler designation and a military record. Transferring him to a VA facility without my direct authorization isn't a hospital director's call to make. I understand that, Mara said. Do you? She held his gaze. The director believes he has the authority. He may be wrong, but I was sent to deliver his position, not to negotiate it. Hayes studied her for a moment in a way that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with the instinct of someone who had spent years reading people under pressure. What's your read on him, the director? I don't think that's a question I should answer. That's an answer, Hayes said. A corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. She put the transfer paperwork on the rolling tray table beside his water cup and took a step back toward the door. That was when Rex stood up. Not aggressively. Not with any of the barking or hackle-raising that might have made sense. He simply rose from his position beside the bed and turned his body 90 degrees toward the wall, toward the upper corner of the room where the ventilation grating sat behind a screwed-in panel, and went completely still. All 4 legs planted. Head up, ears flat, the lead went taut as a wire. Hayes was upright in his bed within half a second, IV line swinging. Rex, status. The dog didn't look at him, didn't look at Mara. He stared at the ventilation panel like it owed him something. Mara had already stopped moving. She was looking at the panel too, but she was looking at it differently. She was looking at the screws. 2 of them on the left side, catching the overhead light at a slightly different angle than the 2 on the right, as if they'd been removed and replaced, as if someone had done it recently enough that the scratching around the screw heads was still bright, not yet oxidized to match the surrounding metal. She was also looking at the edge of the panel itself. The bottom right corner had a gap, maybe 2 millimeters. The kind of gap that meant the panel wasn't fully seated. The kind of gap that happened when something inside the housing was preventing it from lying flush. She could also smell something, faint, under the antiseptic and the cleaning solution and the particular recycled air smell of every hospital she'd ever been in. something chemical, something that didn't belong. Her mouth went dry. She crossed the room in 4 steps, pulled the chair from the corner, stepped up onto it, and put her face close to the ventilation panel without touching it. The smell was stronger up here, sweet and solvent underneath, layered over something else. She recognized not from nursing school or civilian life, but from a compound outside Jalalabad where she'd once spent 6 hours on her stomach on a packed dirt floor talking a scared private through the process of marking a device for disposal. She stepped down from the chair. Hayes was watching her with an entirely different quality of attention now. "Captain," she said, and her voice was completely level, "I need you to stay exactly where you are and not activate the call button." He didn't ask why. She would remember that later. Most people would have asked why. Hayes just nodded once and kept his eyes on her. She moved to the door, checked the hallway. The afternoon shift was mid-transition, half the nursing staff at the station doing handoff, 2 orderlies pushing a supply cart toward the far end of the corridor. Nobody looking at room 11. Nobody who would notice her in the next 30 seconds. She pulled the door almost closed and took out her phone. Not to call hospital security. Not to call 911. She pulled up a contact that wasn't listed by name, only by a 6-digit code she'd memorized years ago and never deleted because some part of her had always known, in the specific way that people who have done certain things always know, that there would be a moment when she would need it. She typed 4 words. Possible device. Maple Crest General. She sent it and put the phone back in her pocket and turned around. Hayes was still watching her. Rex hadn't moved. "You're not just a nurse," Hayes said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him for a moment, at the patient she'd been sent to evict, at the dog who had just changed everything. "Right now," she said. "That's exactly what I am." She pulled a pair of nitrile gloves from her scrub pocket, the ones she always carried, the ones every trauma nurse carried, and put them on with the snapping efficiency of someone who had learned to work with her hands in environments where a wrong move had consequences measured in body counts. "I need you to keep Rex calm and stay off that call button. Can you do that?" "Yes," Hayes said immediately. "Good." She was already moving back toward the ventilation panel. "Because if I'm right about what's up there, the next 20 minutes are going to be the most important 20 minutes this hospital has ever had. And if I'm wrong, the worst thing that happens is I lose my job for going off protocol." "And if you're right?" Mara glanced back at him. "If I'm right," she said, "losing my job is the least of our problems." She stepped back onto the chair and, with the particular focused stillness of someone operating on the right side of controlled fear, she began to examine the screws. The panel had been accessed within the last 48 hours. She could tell from the torque marks, whoever had done it had used a power tool, leaving faint circular scratching patterns that a hand screwdriver wouldn't produce. They'd tried to clean up the marks. They hadn't done a good enough job. One of the screws on the lower left was cross-threaded, meaning it had been reinstalled in a hurry or by someone working with limited light or limited time, probably both. The smell was cleaner now that she was this close. She cataloged it automatically, the way she'd once cataloged everything in the field: primary odor, secondary odor, trace compounds her brain was trying to match to a library that should have gone dormant the day she handed in her separation papers. It hadn't. She pressed 2 fingers very lightly against the panel face, feeling for vibration. There was a faint hum, the HVAC system cycling, but underneath it, something with a different frequency, something mechanical that wasn't building infrastructure. She stepped down and pulled out her phone again. This time she typed differently. Confirmed alert. Ventilation housing, trauma floor, room 11 corridor. Need EOD assessment. Advise on secondary approach. The response came in 40 seconds. Whoever was on the other end was not slow. Received. Do not touch. Hold and observe. Assets mobilizing. How long do you have? She looked at the panel. Looked at the hallway through the door crack. Looked at her watch. Unknown, she typed back. Possible timer or remote. Dog alert suggests active configuration. Stay put. Do not evacuate floor yet. Movement could trigger. Keep to 30-foot radius. Assets 18 minutes out. 18 minutes. She put the phone away and turned to face Hayes, who had moved himself to the edge of the bed with his IV line carefully gathered and his bad leg held at an angle that had to be costing him something considerable in pain. 18 minutes, she told him quietly. Until what? Until people who know what they're doing get here. She crossed to the door and pressed it fully shut. Until then, you and I are going to stay very still and very quiet and not touch anything we haven't already touched. Hayes looked at her leg, then at the ventilation panel, then back at her. What branch? She didn't answer immediately. Army, she finally said. What specialty? The pause was shorter this time, because the situation had already taken the decision out of her hands. Because the panel in the corner had already stripped away 3 years of careful construction. Because Declan Hayes, who had been watching people under pressure his entire adult life, already knew the answer and was simply waiting for her to confirm it. EOD, Mara said. 71st Ordnance Group, Bravo team. Hayes absorbed this the way he absorbed everything, without visible surprise, as if he was simply cataloging a new data point and slotting it into a picture that was becoming clearer. And now you're a trauma nurse in Harlow, Colorado. And now I'm a trauma nurse in Harlow, Colorado, she said. Who needs you to stay calm for 17 more minutes? He looked at her steadily. Then he looked at Rex, who was still fixed on the ventilation panel with the unbreakable concentration of a dog doing exactly what it had been trained to do. Rex flagged it before you even came in, didn't he? Hayes said. It wasn't quite a question. About 30 seconds before I walked through the door, from the look of his positioning, yes. He's been twitchy since yesterday afternoon. I thought it was the hospital smell. A muscle worked in Hayes's jaw. I should have trusted him. You didn't know what you were looking for, Mara said. He did. She moved to the window and checked the angle to the parking lot below. She could see the main entrance, the ambulance bay, a slice of the visitor's lot. Nothing yet. The sky was the flat gray of a November that hadn't made up its mind about winter, and the parking lot was ordinary and unremarkable. And somewhere inside the ventilation housing above them, something sat in the dark waiting. Her phone buzzed. Assets 12 minutes. Recon reports possible secondary contact on premises. Do not engage. Observe only. She read it twice. Secondary contact. Someone who had placed the device, or someone monitoring it, or both. Someone who was currently somewhere in the building, in the hospital that had 3 main entrances and a service corridor and a loading dock and an elevator bank, and... She moved back to the door. What? Hayes said. Stay here, she said. I mean it. Donovan, 12 minutes, she said. Don't let Rex off the lead. Don't touch the call button. Don't let anyone in this room. She opened the door a few inches and looked out into the corridor. The orderlies with the supply cart were gone. The 2 nurses at the station were still at the station, heads down over paperwork. The hallway was its ordinary mid-afternoon self. Institutional green and fluorescent and smelling of antiseptic and something that might have been cafeteria chili from 3 floors below. And a man in a maintenance uniform was walking slowly along the far wall, 20 feet from the ventilation access point in the corridor above room 11, looking at his phone with the particular studied casualness of someone who wanted very much to appear like he belonged here and had not quite committed the performance. Mara had spent 3 years learning to look like she belonged somewhere she didn't. She recognized the effort instantly. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, and she didn't look at it. She watched the man in the maintenance uniform take 3 more steps and stop. He was looking at the ceiling now, at the section of ceiling that ran directly above the corridor between rooms 10 and 12. At the junction box mounted up there that she'd walked past 100 times without registering. She registered it now. She pulled the door back just far enough to slip through and let it close behind her without a sound. And she started down the corridor toward the nurse's station with her hands loose at her sides and her face arranged in the specific expression of a nurse moving with purpose who has somewhere to be. And she was calculating the distance to the station and the distance to the man in the maintenance uniform and the distance to the door that led to the stairwell. And behind all of that, she was listening to the clock inside her chest counting down from 12 minutes to something she couldn't name yet, but knew with absolute certainty was already in motion. And the man in the maintenance uniform looked up from the ceiling and his eyes met hers across 20 feet of institutional corridor, and for a half second, just a half second, his expression did something that no maintenance worker's expression should ever do. He recognized her, not as Mara Donovan, trauma nurse, as someone who was in his way. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket, and her feet were already carrying her forward, and the hallway stretched between them like a wire pulled tight, and the nurses at the station hadn't looked up yet. And Rex was somewhere behind a closed door doing his job, and Mara's right hand was 3 inches from the radio clipped to the nurse's station counter, and everything in the next 30 seconds was going to matter in ways that no amount of keeping her head down had prepared her for. And then the man smiled, casually, and turned back to his clipboard, and kept walking. She stopped 5 feet from the nurse's station, heart running at about 140, breathing through it, watching the maintenance man move away down the corridor toward the service exit. He hadn't run. He hadn't escalated, which meant he wasn't done. He was just recalculating. She picked up the nurse's station radio, turned her back to the corridor, and said very quietly to the charge nurse, who was looking at her with mild irritation, "I need you to call a facilities check on the ventilation junction in this corridor, right now. Tell them it's a non-emergency equipment review. Don't use the overhead PA. Don't call in all staff. Just do it quietly, and do it now." The charge nurse, Sandra, who had worked trauma floors for 22 years, and had the particular quality of someone who had learned to take unusual requests seriously when they came from people who looked the way Mara currently looked, put down her pen and picked up her phone without asking why. Mara turned back toward the corridor. The maintenance man was gone. The door to the service stairwell was swinging slowly shut. She checked her phone. 9 minutes. The device above room 11 was either on a timer she couldn't see or waiting for a remote signal from a man who was now 1 floor below her or above her, or moving through the parts of this building she didn't know as well as she should. She made a decision. She moved toward the stairwell. Not running. Walking fast with purpose. The way someone moves when they've worked in hospitals long enough to have learned that the one thing you never do is run. Because running means emergency, and emergency means panic. And panic in a building with 112 patients currently occupying beds on 4 floors means something she wasn't willing to let happen. She hit the stairwell door and let it close behind her. The stairs were empty. The stairwell smelled of paint and concrete and the cold draft from the parking structure on the east side of the building. She listened. Below her, 3 or 4 floors down, something that might have been a footstep, or might have been the building settling, or might have been nothing at all. Above her, nothing. She looked at the underside of the stairwell landing above, at the electrical panel mounted there, at the 2 screws on its housing that had the same bright scratching around their heads as the ones on the ventilation panel in room 11. Not one device. 2. She was already typing when the stairwell door behind her crashed open and Sandra's voice came through at a pitch she'd never heard from her before. "Donovan, there's a man on the service camera in the basement. He's at the HVAC control board." 8 minutes. Mara ran. She ran down the stairwell, the way she hadn't run anywhere in 3 years. Not the jog of a nurse responding to a code, not the controlled urgency of someone trying not to cause a scene, but the actual flat-out sprint of a person who has done a threat calculation and arrived at a number she doesn't like. 2 flights. Basement level. She hit the door at the bottom with her shoulder, and it swung hard into the concrete wall behind it, and she was already through before it bounced back. The basement corridor was narrow and poorly lit, the kind of space that existed in every large building to hide the infrastructure nobody wanted to think about. Pipes running the length of the ceiling, junction boxes bolted to the walls at irregular intervals, the distant thrumming of the HVAC system running at full. Thursday afternoon capacity, pushing conditioned air through every duct in the building, through the ducts that ran past room 11, past the stairwell, landing above, past every floor between the basement and the roof. She could hear him before she saw him. Not footsteps, something else. A low mechanical sound, deliberate, like someone working a panel with tools. The specific rhythm of a person who knows exactly what they're doing and is doing it fast. She slowed down. Force of habit, and something more than habit. You didn't run at a man working near an explosive device. You didn't do anything fast near a man working near an explosive device. You moved like water. You moved like you had all the time in the world, even when you absolutely did not. 7 minutes, maybe 6.5 by now. The HVAC control room was at the end of the basement corridor, behind a gray metal door marked with a yellow authorized personnel only sticker that someone had partially picked off. The door was open 6 inches. Warm air and the smell of machine oil, and something else, that same layered chemical smell from upstairs, stronger down here, moving through the ventilation intake like a signature. She stopped 4 feet from the door and pressed her back against the wall. She had no weapon. She had nitrile gloves, a phone, a badge that said Maple Crest General across the top, and Donovan, MRN, across the middle, and 3 years of very determined effort to be someone who didn't need any of what she'd left behind. What she also had was 8 years of muscle memory that didn't care what she'd decided. She looked at the panel on the wall beside her, a secondary electrical junction, the kind that controlled the corridor lighting and the emergency exit signage on this level. The panel had a handle. The handle, if pulled, would kill power to this section of the basement. She pulled it. The corridor went dark. The sound behind the HVAC door stopped. 1 second of silence. 2. Who's there? Not a question. Flat and clipped, the voice of someone running a calculation. She was already moving. In the dark, she had an advantage he didn't know about. She'd walked this corridor twice during her first week at Maple Crest, because she'd made a point of learning the basement layout of every building she worked in, and she'd kept the count of her steps, and she knew the door was 4 steps from where she'd been standing and slightly to her left. She reached it, pushed it open with 2 fingers, and flattened herself against the doorframe. The HVAC room was lit by a single work light on a portable stand, casting a harsh directional glow across the control board, and the man crouched in front of it. I was 30-something, lean, wearing the maintenance uniform she'd seen in the corridor upstairs, with a canvas bag open on the floor beside him, and 2 components she recognized sitting on top of it. Not both components she needed to identify. Just one was enough. He turned toward the door. In the dark outside it, she was invisible. To him, the doorway was a black rectangle, and the corridor beyond was nothing. "Martinez," he said towards the doorway, "took you long enough." She waited 3 seconds, long enough for him to begin to feel uncertain. Then she stepped into the doorway and said, "Martinez isn't coming." He moved fast. She'd expected that. The type of person who did this kind of work didn't freeze up when things went wrong. He was on his feet with the bag in one hand and his other hand going to his jacket before she'd finished the sentence, and she crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and put her right forearm into his wrist before his hand cleared the jacket pocket, and the thing he'd been reaching for hit the concrete floor and skittered under the control board. They went sideways into the control panel. Metal edges, sharp corners, the work light toppling and rolling and throwing shadows in all directions. He was bigger than her and faster than she'd given him credit for, and he got his left elbow into her jaw hard enough that her vision whited out for a second, and she tasted copper and lost her grip on his wrist. He pulled back and she came back, and they did 3 seconds of the very ugly, very unglamorous thing that hand-to-hand actually is outside of training scenarios. All bad angles and poor footing, and the desperate brute math of who makes the next mistake first. She got her knee into his thigh on the 3rd exchange. Not the target she'd been aiming for, but it was enough to shift his weight wrong, and she used the half second it bought her to get behind him and get her right arm across his throat, and she locked it with her left hand, and she held. He clawed at her forearm. He tried to drop his weight. She rode it down with him, both of them on the concrete floor now, and she kept the pressure even and deliberate, and she talked to him while she did it, which was something she'd learned years ago from a sergeant who'd told her that in close work you always talk to them because it gave your mind something to do other than panic. "Stop fighting," she said directly into his ear. "You're going to stop fighting right now. The building is already compromised. Whatever you were told to do down here, it's over. Stop." He didn't stop immediately. They never did. But 20 seconds in, when the pressure on the carotid finally did what physics required it to do, he stopped. She held for 3 more seconds. Then she rolled back and pulled him onto his side, kicked the canvas bag across the room, and sat on the floor of the Maple Crest General basement with her back against the HVAC control board, and her hands shaking in a way she was going to need them to stop doing in approximately the next 90 seconds. Her phone buzzed. "Assets on site. North parking structure." "Where are you?" She typed, "Basement HVAC. Subject down. Secure the stairwell landing on floor 2, secondary device and electrical panel. Confirm room 11 vent device still static." She hit send and pressed both palms flat against the concrete floor and breathed. The man on the floor was unconscious and breathing. The bag across the room wasn't going anywhere. The device upstairs was either on a timer she couldn't see or waiting for a remote signal that this man was no longer in a position to transmit. And until someone told her otherwise, she was going to operate on the assumption that holding this room and holding this man was the most useful thing she could do in the next 3 to 4 minutes. She picked up the thing that had skittered under the control board. It was a phone. Burner, basic model, with a single app open on the screen. She didn't touch the app. She photographed the screen with her own phone and sent it to the same contact. Her jaw was starting to swell. She worked it carefully, tested the hinge, decided nothing was broken. She'd been hit harder. She'd rather not make a habit of it at 34, but she'd been hit harder. Her phone. Acknowledged. 2-man entry team in stairwell now. Status on civilian population? She pulled up the hospital census from memory. She'd reviewed it at the start of her shift because she always reviewed it, because knowing how many people were in a building was the kind of habit you didn't unlearn. 112 patients, 4 floors. Staff approximately 40 on current shift. Trauma floor. A floor, 11 patients. Evacuation recommendation? She thought about what the man upstairs on the other end of her contact chain had said. Don't evacuate, movement could trigger. She thought about the layout of the building, the ventilation system, the 2 locations she'd identified, what a device placed at those specific points would be designed to do versus what it would actually do if it went active. Partial, she typed back. Floors 3 and 4, non-urgent. Keep trauma floor locked. HVAC needs to be shut down manually from here. Tell your team what to look for. Send photo of control board. She took 3 photos and sent them. Then she got to her feet, because sitting on the floor of a basement when you had active work to do was something she could feel sorry for herself about later. The man on the floor groaned. Don't, she said, not unkindly. He opened his eyes, looked at the ceiling, looked at her. The calculation behind his eyes was the same one she'd seen in the corridor upstairs, assessing, filing, deciding. You made a mistake, he said. His voice was rough from what she'd done to his throat. Several, she agreed. Today specifically, or are we talking career arc? He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. Who sent you here? She said. Still nothing. You had 2 devices placed on the same floor, both tied to the ventilation system. That's not a random bombing. That's a targeted strike against a specific area with a specific population. She crouched down to his eye level. Room 11. Captain Hayes. That's what this is about. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt. More like recalibration. The expression of someone revising an assessment about who they were dealing with. You're not security, he said. No. Hospital? Yes and no. He looked at the ceiling again. Then you've already made calls you can't take back. And whoever's coming through that door in the next few minutes isn't going to be local police. Probably not, Mara said. Then we're both in a situation we can't walk out of the way we came in. She stood up. Only one of us has a problem with that. The 2 men who came through the basement door 4 minutes later were not wearing uniforms. They were wearing civilian clothes, dark jackets, work boots, and they moved through the basement corridor with the particular quality of motion that Mara recognized the way you recognize a dialect you learned young. They were military, both of them, and they were current, not former, because former military moved like they were trying not to look like military, and current moved like they'd simply accepted that they always would. The taller one, sandy-haired, maybe early 40s, the kind of face that had spent time outdoors in climates that weren't kind, stopped in the HVAC doorway and looked at the man on the floor, then at Mara, then at the canvas bag against the far wall. Donovan, he said. Yeah. Kerrigan. We talked. He hadn't come through her original contact. He'd been the one texting back. She'd assumed a comms operator, maybe a coordination desk. He was very clearly not a comms operator. Control board's already shut down? Ventilation system, yes. Main power is still running. I didn't want to kill the OR. Kerrigan looked at the board, then at the photos she'd taken, then at his partner, shorter, dark-haired, moving through the room without being invited in a way that said he'd done this before many times in places less comfortable than a hospital basement. Ruiz. Bag. Ruiz went to the canvas bag without touching it and crouched down and examined it for about 12 seconds with a small flashlight. Then he looked back at Kerrigan. Not rigged. Components only. He didn't finish the secondary. Because we interrupted him, Kerrigan said. He was looking at Mara again. Because I interrupted him, she said. A pause. Because you interrupted him, he agreed. Not a concession, just an accurate recitation of what happened. The device upstairs is the one that matters. Our third asset is working it now. You said single device, room 11 ventilation housing? The one in the vent housing is what Rex flagged. I identified a second probable in the stairwell landing electrical panel on floor 2. Haven't confirmed it, but the indicators match. Same screw pattern, same chemical trace. Kerrigan looked at the man on the floor. 2 devices, 1 operator. 2 operators, Mara said. He said Martinez. Someone else was in this building, probably still is. The thing about people who did this for a living was that they didn't react to information like that the way normal people did. Kerrigan simply nodded. Ruiz was already on his radio, speaking in the abbreviated shorthand of someone who'd been doing it long enough that it had become a separate language. The man on the floor had gone very still, which meant he was listening hard, which meant he wasn't as concussed as he'd been pretending. Mara said, "He's tracking your comms." Ruiz looked at the man on the floor, then pulled the radio away from his mouth and switched frequencies without breaking his sentence. The man on the floor's expression didn't change, but he'd been hoping she wouldn't notice, and she had, and they both knew it. "Can you get back upstairs?" Kerrigan said. "I'm already upstairs in my head," she said. What do you need?" "Hayes needs to move. Not far. There's a supply corridor on the trauma floor's west end that doesn't run over any of the ductwork we're concerned about. Get him there. Don't use a wheelchair. The floor vibration from—" "I know," she said. "I'll use a transfer board and keep him low." Kerrigan looked at her for a second. "What unit?" 71st Ordnance, Bravo team." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise. More like the particular recognition of someone hearing a name they'd come across in a file at some point and now attaching it to a person. "Afghanistan. 3 tours. You've been here 3 years?" "Yes." He held her look for one more second, then nodded at the door. "Go. We'll handle the floor." She went. The stairwell going up felt longer than it had going down, which was purely psychological, and she knew it, and it didn't help. Her jaw was throbbing with real commitment now, and her right forearm had a raised welt from the control panel edge she'd taken during the struggle in the basement, and there was a smear of someone else's blood. Not much, just a scrape's worth, on the cuff of her left sleeve that she kept her arm turned inward to hide. She came through the trauma floor door and moved straight to room 11. Hayes had done exactly what she'd asked, which she'd half expected and was still relieved by. He was sitting at the edge of the bed with his bad leg carefully extended and Rex sitting beside him, both of them watching the door with the same quality of attention. The transfer paperwork she'd brought up an hour ago, which felt like it belonged to a different day entirely, had been moved to the windowsill and folded in half, out of the way. "You're hurt," Hayes said immediately. "I'm operational," she said, which was not exactly an answer but was the one she had available. She moved to the supply cabinet on the wall and pulled out the transfer board, a smooth, rigid sheet used to slide non-ambulatory patients between surfaces without lifting. "I need to move you. There's a supply corridor on the west side of this floor. No overhead ductwork. You're going there while some people I trust work the situation in this hallway." Hayes was already assessing the board, the distance to the door, his leg. Rex comes. His lead stays short. "What's the threat status?" She started clearing the space between the bed and the door. 2 identified devices, one in the vent above this corridor, one probable on floor 2, both connected to this ventilation system, which is now shut down. Active response team is on site. The man who was in this building working the HVAC has been secured. Hayes was quiet for a second. "You said the man." "There may be a second, a Martinez. We haven't located him." Another pause. "How many people know about this building?" She stopped moving and looked at him. It was a specific question, not how many people know about the devices. How many people know about this building? "What do you mean?" "Maple Crest General, Harlow, Colorado." He held her look. "Nobody knows I'm here except my unit, my commanding officer, and the VA intake coordinator who arranged the civilian transfer. I wasn't supposed to be at a military facility because the injury happened during an off-base exercise, and the classification on the exercise means the paperwork routes through civilian channels." He said it slowly, like he'd been sitting with it for 48 hours and had finally found someone worth saying it to. "Which means whoever set this up knew exactly where to find me." The room felt slightly smaller than it had a moment ago. "You think someone inside your chain of command?" "I think the intake coordinator at the VA routing office is a civilian contractor," Hayes said. I think I've been in this room for 2 days, and the only people outside my immediate unit who knew where I was transferred are people who've had access to contractor-processed medical logistics records. He looked at the vent panel. Rex hadn't moved from his position facing it. This wasn't random, and it wasn't just about me. The brief said your exercise classification. What was the exercise? I can't tell you that. Captain, I genuinely cannot tell you that, he said, and she believed him because the look on his face wasn't obstruction. It was the particular careful blankness of someone carrying something they weren't allowed to put down, regardless of what was happening around them. What I can tell you is that there are 4 other members of my unit who were on the same exercise, and I don't know where any of them were transferred after the operation. The implications of that settled over the room like a pressure change. We need to move you, she said. Now. Everything else is a conversation for after you're out of range of that vent. Hayes didn't argue. He shifted his weight, and she positioned the transfer board, and they moved him, awkwardly, imperfectly, with Hayes hissing through his teeth at one point when his leg caught an angle it didn't want, and Mara overcorrecting and losing her grip on the board for a half second. Not smoothly, not cleanly, the way people who've practiced this do it, but successfully, which was all that mattered. Rex walked beside them with his lead in Hayes' hand and his eyes scanning the corridor as they moved. The supply corridor on the west side of the trauma floor was exactly what it sounded like. A narrow access passage behind the main ward, used for linen deliveries and equipment storage, smelling of clean laundry and rubber. It had 2 fluorescent strip lights and no windows, and a door at each end that locked from the inside. It was also, by the exact logic she'd applied, in the one section of the floor where the ductwork ran perpendicular rather than overhead. She got Hayes settled on a transfer gurney. She pulled from the equipment row with his legs supported at the right angle and Rex's lead looped around the gurney leg, and she checked his IV line, which had survived the move with only minor trauma, and she looked at his face to see how the pain had landed. Scale of 1 to 10, she said. 5, he said. Honest answer. 7. A beat. Don't write it down. She pulled a cold pack from the supply shelf, snapped it, handed it to him. He took it without asking what for and pressed it to the inside of his knee. She turned back toward the door. Donovan. She stopped. How long were you EOD before? 8 years, she said, without turning around. Why nursing? She thought about how to answer that. She'd had 3 years to practice the answer, and she'd never quite gotten it right. People in hospitals are trying to stay in the world, she finally said. It felt like the same work. Hayes was quiet for a moment, then, it is the same work. She opened the supply corridor door and went back to the trauma floor. What she found when she came through was not chaos. It was the controlled suppression of chaos, which was in some ways harder to navigate. Kerrigan's people had added 2 more to their number, both now in the corridor working the ventilation panel above room 11 with equipment that had come from somewhere she hadn't seen brought in. Sandra was at the nurses' station running a quiet partial evacuation of the upper floors, patient by patient, framed as a routine transfer drill, and she was doing it with the practiced composure of someone who had survived enough real emergencies to know that tone was infrastructure. 3 of the trauma floor's other patients were being quietly moved toward the east ward. Nobody was using the intercom. Gerald Strom had also arrived. He was standing at the entrance to the trauma wing in his Navy suit with his ID badge clipped to his breast pocket and his arms crossed and his face arranged in the expression of a man who had been told something had happened in his hospital and had not yet determined whether to be concerned about the hospital or concerned about himself. He was speaking to a woman Mara didn't recognize, tall, mid-50s, silver hair pulled back, civilian clothes that fit like they'd been bought for purpose rather than fashion. The woman was listening to Strom with the particular quality of attention that meant she was not going to say anything she didn't have to. Mara moved toward them. Strom saw her first. Donovan, what in the hell is happening on my floor? I've had 3 nurses tell me 3 different things, and someone has apparently initiated a partial patient transfer without my authorization. Director Strom, Mara said, I need you to step back from this hallway and let these people work. Strom's face did the thing she'd watched it do 100 times in 3 years, the tightening around the jaw, the slight lift of the chin that meant he was reasserting his authority in the only way available to him in that moment, which was through height and volume. You don't give me directives in my hospital, Donovan. You were sent up here to deliver paperwork and... Gerald. The silver-haired woman said it quietly. Not loud, not sharp. Just his name, and with something behind it that made Strom stop mid-sentence. The woman looked at him for a moment. "Let's go to your office. I want to know what federal personnel are doing on my trauma floor. And I'll tell you what I'm authorized to tell you," the woman said. "In your office. Not here." Strom looked at Mara with something in his eyes that she'd seen before on people who had just realized the ground had shifted under them and hadn't worked out in which direction. Then he turned and walked toward his office with the woman behind him, and Mara watched them go. She crossed to where Kerrigan was standing near the vent panel. His team had the housing partially open, and she could see a third person, the one he'd called the third asset, she assumed, working carefully at the interior components. The work light they'd brought cast a clean, hard-edged glow across the ceiling. "Second device," she said. "Found it. Stairwell panel, floor 2. It's live but static. No timer running. Remote trigger only." He was looking at the housing. "The room 11 device is the same, both waiting for a single signal. Which means Martinez still has the trigger. Which means Martinez is still in this building." He looked at her. "We've swept floors 1 through 4. He's not on any floor we can find." She thought about the layout, about the places in a building that weren't on the official map, about the things you learned when you spent 3 years somewhere that had nothing to do with your job description and everything to do with the way you were wired. "The basement has a secondary mechanical room," she said, "behind the boiler bank. It's not on the facility's schematic because it was sealed off during a 1990s renovation and reopened for storage about 4 years ago. It's listed in the maintenance logs as overflow storage, but it has its own ventilation intake." She paused. "I found it in my first week here because I was looking for somewhere quiet to eat lunch." Kerrigan looked at her. "Sometimes that's how it goes," she said. He turned to Ruiz. "You heard her. Secondary mechanical, behind the boilers." Ruiz was already moving. Kerrigan stayed. "The intake from that room," Mara said. "Does it connect to the main duct trunk?" Kerrigan looked at the person working the vent housing. "Torres, secondary mechanical intake. Does it run to the main trunk?" Torres didn't look up. If the building was renovated in stages, probably yes. Pre-1990s construction typically a pause while something was examined. "Yeah, it's on the same trunk. If someone in that room has a device connected to the intake, then shutting down the main system didn't isolate it," Mara said. "It would have its own local draw," Torres confirmed. She and Kerrigan looked at each other. "Ruiz is walking into a room where the person inside may have an active trigger and a local device," Mara said. Kerrigan already had his radio up. She watched his face as he tried to reach Ruiz. Watched it again when the radio came back with static. The secondary mechanical room was behind concrete and steel, and it was killing the signal. She said, "There's a hardline phone in the boiler room. Old maintenance line. I don't know if it still works." "How do you know that?" "I told you. I eat lunch in quiet places." Kerrigan made a decision in about 2 seconds. "Can you get down there faster than I can?" She was already moving before he finished the sentence, because the answer was yes. She knew the layout, and he didn't. And because Ruiz was walking toward a man with a remote trigger who didn't know he was coming, and because the last thing she needed was someone else making the situation worse through a door she'd been through before. She hit the stairwell and went down at a pace that wasn't quite reckless and wasn't quite careful. And she came out in the basement corridor and went left instead of right, past the HVAC room where the man she'd put down was now apparently being managed by someone she hadn't seen come in, and past the secondary junction panel and around the back of the boiler bank. The door to the secondary mechanical room was 3 inches open. She could hear voices. 2 of them. Ruiz, very controlled, the tone of someone who'd found their target and was in the opening seconds of managing it. And another voice, tighter, higher-pitched, with the specific quality of fear that she recognized as distinct from the calm she'd heard in the man upstairs. This one was scared. This one hadn't expected to still be here. She pushed the door open and stepped in. Ruiz had Martinez against the far wall. Martinez was younger than she'd expected, mid-20s, barely, with the look of someone who had been told a version of this assignment that was significantly different from the version he was currently living through. In his right hand, loose, no longer held with any conviction, was a small black transmitter. The kind that required a sustained press to activate, not a single button. A design feature she recognized, because that feature existed specifically to prevent accidental activation and specifically to require a conscious, committed choice To deploy. Martinez was looking at Ruiz. He hadn't seen her come in. She looked at his hand, at the transmitter, at the particular angle of his wrist, which was not the angle of a man who was about to press anything. It was the angle of a man who was holding something he no longer knew what to do with. "Put it on the ground," Ruiz said. "Slowly. Keep your thumb off the—" "I didn't know what the targets were," Martinez said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "They told me it was infrastructure, property damage only. They said nobody would—" "Device on the ground," Ruiz said. "We'll talk about what you knew after." Martinez looked at Ruiz. Then his eyes moved to the door, to Mara, and something in his face broke open. Not theatrically, not dramatically, just the way things break when they've been under too much pressure for too long, and the last possible reason to hold together disappears. He crouched down slowly and set the transmitter on the concrete floor. Ruiz moved forward, and Mara crossed to the wall phone and picked it up, half expecting silence, getting instead the tinny drone of an old analog line that had been sitting unused long enough to sound surprised about it. She pressed 0 for the internal line and got the trauma floor desk. And when Sandra picked up on the second ring, she said, "Tell Kerrigan, secondary mechanical. We have the device and the operator. Tell him we're clear." There was a pause. Then Sandra said, "He's going to want to hear that from you." "I know," Mara said. "Tell him anyway." She set the phone back in the cradle and turned around. Martinez was zip-tied and sitting against the boiler with Ruiz crouched in front of him. The transmitter was in an evidence bag that Ruiz had produced from somewhere. The secondary mechanical room smelled of old grease and rust, and the particular staleness of a space that had spent years mostly forgotten. Mara leaned against the wall. Her jaw hurt. Her forearm hurt. Her feet hurt in the specific way that came from running in nursing clogs. She looked at Martinez, at the young, scared face of someone who had been recruited for something and had only now understood its full shape. "Who gave you the assignment?" she said. Martinez looked at Ruiz, then at Mara. "I only had a name, a handler name. I don't know if it was real." "Give it anyway." He swallowed. "Aldridge. They called him Aldridge." The name meant nothing to her. She filed it. Names had a way of connecting to other things given time, and she had a feeling, looking at the devices that had been placed in this building, at the specificity of the targeting, at the way it had all been built around a man in room 11 who had been on a classified exercise that moved through civilian medical channels. She had a feeling that time was something she was about to have less of, not more. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Not Kerrigan. Not her contact. A number she didn't recognize and a message that stopped her breath for half a second. "Donovan. We need to talk about what Hayes's team found 18 months ago in the Rannoch Valley. You already know more than you think you do. Don't trust everyone in that building." She stared at the message for 3 full seconds. Then she looked up at Ruiz, who was on his radio and not looking at her. At Martinez, who was staring at the floor. At the door to the secondary mechanical room, which was still 3 inches open. And at the shadow on the other side of it, which had been there for approximately 30 seconds, which was long enough to have heard everything Martinez had just said, and which was now gone. She moved to the door in 3 steps and pushed it open and looked into the basement corridor. Empty. Not the empty of a space nobody had been in, the empty of a space someone had just left, which had a different quality entirely. A quality she'd learned to read in places where the difference mattered. The overhead fluorescent at the far end of the corridor was still swinging slightly on its mounting, a 1/4-inch arc that meant someone had passed close enough to disturb the air current near it, maybe 15 seconds ago, maybe 20. She looked both ways, left toward the boiler access and the secondary mechanical entry, right toward the main basement corridor, the HVAC room, the stairwell. The stairwell door was fully closed. She went back inside and crossed to Ruiz. Someone was in the corridor, listening. They're in the stairwell now, or past it. Ruiz looked up from Martinez. "Description?" "Shadow, movement. That's all I have." "How long were they there?" "Long enough." She held up her phone, showed him the message, watched his face process it. "That came in during the conversation. The number's not in any contact list I have." Ruiz read it twice, then took out his own phone and photographed her screen. "Don't respond. Don't delete it." He stood. "I need to call this up. There's no signal down here." "I know." He looked at Martinez. "Stay." It was the same word you'd use with a dog, and it carried the same certainty that it would be obeyed, and Martinez, who had run entirely out of available options, stayed. Ruiz crossed to the wall phone and picked it up. Mara went back to the doorway. She stood there looking at the corridor and letting the information she had lay itself out in front of her the way she'd been trained to lay out a threat picture. Not emotionally, not urgently, but systematically, like a map you were drawing in real time from pieces that kept arriving in the wrong order. 2 devices in the building, both targeting the ventilation system in the zone around room 11. 1 operator in the basement, 1 probable in the corridor upstairs who'd come down and been interrupted. A handler named Aldridge, which meant nothing to her. A message about something called Rannoch Valley, connected to Hayes's unit, connected to something 18 months ago. And a shadow in a corridor that had been there long enough to hear a scared kid give up a name and was now somewhere in a building that Kerrigan's team had already swept. Which meant either Kerrigan's sweep had missed something, or the person in the corridor had been somewhere Kerrigan's team hadn't checked, or they were someone Kerrigan's team had looked at and not identified. She didn't like any of those options. Ruiz came back from the phone. His face was doing the controlled neutral thing that faces did when the information they'd received was worse than expected. "I need you upstairs," he said. "Kerrigan is pulling everyone to the trauma floor. There's a development." "What development?" "The vent device. Torres says the configuration isn't what we initially assessed." She felt the cold thing move through her chest again. "Meaning what?" "Meaning it's not a standard fragmentation setup. Torres thinks it's dispersal." He looked at her steadily. "Chemical dispersal." The map in her head redrew itself in about 2 seconds. Everything she'd assumed about the target radius, the blast pattern, the casualty projection, redrew itself around a different center. "The ventilation system," she said, "was already running for 6 hours before we shut it down. Whatever's in that device has been cycling through the ductwork since it was placed." "But the device is still intact, nothing dispersed." "Correct. The dispersal requires active triggering. The device isn't passive. It doesn't release on impact or on timer. It requires the remote signal." He looked at the phone she was still holding, which Martinez had, which is now in an evidence bag. "Yes. But if the message you received is accurate, if there's someone in this building who was there to monitor the operation rather than run it, they may have a backup trigger." She was already moving toward the stairwell. The trauma floor had changed in the 20 minutes she'd been in the basement. The partial evacuation had progressed. 2 more patient rooms were empty, gurneys stripped, monitoring equipment dark. Sandra had managed it with a competence that Mara would think about later, when there was time to think. The nurses who remained were doing what good nurses did in situations they didn't fully understand. They were focused, quiet, and keeping their hands busy with the work that was right in front of them, because that was how you stayed functional when the larger picture was something you couldn't affect. Torres was still at the vent housing, but the work had stopped. Torres was standing back from it now, with the specific posture of someone who had encountered a problem and was in the process of deciding how to handle it without making it worse. Kerrigan was beside her when she came through the door. "Tell me about chemical dispersal in this configuration," he said, without preamble. "I need to see the device," she said. "Torres." Torres stepped aside. Mara pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. She'd grabbed them from the supply cabinet in the transfer corridor, old habit, and stepped up on the equipment case Torres had been using as a platform and looked into the open ventilation housing. She'd expected a conventional IED with modifications. What she was looking at was not that. It was compact, smaller than what she would have predicted from the chemical trace smell. And it was integrated into the housing in a way that suggested it had been assembled on site rather than carried in as a finished device, which meant someone with technical knowledge had spent time in this space, in this hospital, preparing this specific setup before Hayes had even arrived, which meant the timing of Hayes's transfer hadn't been reactive. Someone had known he was coming before he got here and had used the lead time. The dispersal mechanism was a pressurized canister, small, seated in a bracket that directed output toward the duct intake. The triggering component was standard, wireless receiver, the kind that worked off a frequency she could identify if she had the equipment, which she didn't. The compound in the canister she couldn't identify by sight, but the smell and the canister markings, partially obscured, gave her enough. She stepped back down. "Incapacitating agent," she said. "Not lethal in itself, not at this concentration in a building this size with this ventilation volume. But at the concentration it would hit a sealed room, thus specifically a trauma room where a patient is on supplemental oxygen, It could cause respiratory arrest in someone with compromised lung function. Kerrigan said, Hayes's chart. His chart shows normal lung function. But if you're designing this for a patient on a trauma floor, you account for variance. Someone else on this floor, on oxygen supplementation, in a smaller room, the calculation changes. She looked at the housing. This wasn't designed to kill the building. It was designed to create a specific casualty in a specific location while producing enough of a secondary effect on surrounding rooms to make the specific casualty look like a system failure. Make it look like a medical event, Torres said quietly. Yes. Kerrigan was quiet for 2 seconds. Can you disarm it? She looked at the device again. At the bracket, the canister, the receiver. At the way it was seated, the way the components related to each other. Whether there was a secondary trigger, she couldn't see from this angle. I need 10 minutes, and I need everyone off this floor except Hayes and Rex. Hayes is in the supply corridor. He needs to stay there, get the remaining patients to the east ward and seal this corridor. If someone has a backup trigger and they activate while I'm working, I need the smallest possible population in the exposure zone. Kerrigan turned to Sandra. Can you clear the remaining patients in 8 minutes? Sandra looked at her patient board. She did the math that nurses did, the real math of bodies and mobility and medication schedules and what could be moved and what couldn't and what the cost would be if she got it wrong. 6, she said. Do it. Sandra picked up her radio and started talking, and the trauma floor began to empty around Mara like water draining, quiet and purposeful and fast. And Mara got back up on the equipment case and looked at the device and began the part that was entirely her own, the part that no one else in the building could do and that she had spent the last 3 years trying to convince herself she no longer needed to be able to do. She started with the receiver. If she could isolate the receiver from the canister, a backup trigger would have nothing to activate. The challenge was the bracket. It had been installed with the specific intent of making disassembly difficult without triggering the pressure release, which meant whoever built it understood the countermeasures. They'd seated the receiver on the downstream side of the canister valve, which meant reaching the receiver required moving past the valve. She breathed. She adjusted her grip. She reminded herself of the basic truth she'd learned on the floor of a compound outside Jalalabad from a sergeant with 20 years and more patience than she'd ever managed to fully acquire, that the device was not her enemy. The device was a problem with a solution, and the solution lived in the specific geometry of the thing in front of her. And if she looked at it long enough and steadily enough, the geometry would show her what it was. It showed her, 4 minutes in, that the bracket had been designed with a particular assumption about the disassembly approach, that anyone attempting to isolate the receiver would come at it from the left, where the access was easier, and would therefore have to cross the valve path. But the right side of the bracket, the side that faced the duct wall, had a mounting tolerance gap. Small, 5-6 millimeters. Tight for the fingers she had. She worked at it from the right. It took 9 minutes, not 10, and at no point during those 9 minutes was it clean or precise or anything that looked like the movie version of what she was doing. Her fingers cramped twice. She lost her grip on the isolation tool she'd improvised from a bent IV needle and had to recover it before it touched the valve housing. She hit the duct wall with her elbow at minute 7 and froze for 3 full seconds until the vibration dissipated and nothing happened. And then the receiver came free in her hand and she held it, and she felt the specific quality of relief that is entirely indistinguishable from exhaustion. And she stepped down from the equipment case and held the receiver out to Kerrigan, who took it with the expression of someone who had been watching something he couldn't assist with for 9 minutes and had found it extremely uncomfortable. Canister is still live, she said. It needs a hazmat disposal team, not me. I'm EOD, not chemical. But it's not going anywhere and it can't be remotely triggered. Kerrigan was already on his radio. That was when the fire alarm went off. Not the mechanical beep of a test. The full evacuation alarm, building-wide, the one with the strobes in the corridors and the recorded announcement cycling through in a flat female voice. It was loud enough to feel in the chest. Mara looked at Kerrigan. That's not us, he said. I know. It was the building's standard fire suppression response, which meant someone had triggered a pull station, which meant someone had deliberately initiated an evacuation sequence. And in a building that still had an isolated chemical device in a ventilation housing and a backup trigger potentially in someone's hand, a forced evacuation was not a safety measure. It was a hurting action. She pushed through the door to the main corridor and looked toward the east ward, where Sandra's evacuation had been routing the remaining patients. The east corridor was filling with movement, the controlled, purposeful movement of staff following procedure, which was exactly right and exactly wrong at the same time, because procedure said evacuate and procedure had just become a weapon. She found Sandra at the junction point. Where do the elevators go? South lobby, main entrance. Don't use the elevators. Don't use the south stairwell. Route everyone to the north exit, stairs only. It's a longer walk. That'll add 4 minutes to the south stairwell has an electrical panel on the landing, Mara said. Same signature as the room 11 device. I reported it, but I don't know if it's been cleared. She looked at Sandra directly. Don't use the south stairwell. Sandra looked at her for 1 second. Then she turned and started redirecting, and Mara moved back toward the trauma wing because the supply corridor was in the trauma wing, and the supply corridor was where she'd left Hayes. The corridor was empty. The supply corridor door was still closed. She pushed it open. Hayes was on the gurney where she'd left him, leg elevated, IV intact, Rex sitting at the gurney side in the same attentive position he'd held in room 11, because Rex was the kind of working dog who understood that his job was continuity regardless of what the building decided to do around him. Hayes was holding his phone with the screen dark, and his expression was the expression of a man who had been listening to an alarm for 60 seconds and was managing the instinct to do something about it through the discipline of knowing that the something he would do would likely make things worse. Status, he said when she came in. Building evacuation, not us. Someone pulled the alarm. Martinez? Martinez is in custody in the basement, someone else. She moved to the door at the far end of the supply corridor, the one that opened to the north utility passage, which was the route she needed. Can you put weight on that leg for 30 seconds? Because I have a gurney, and I have a transfer board, but I don't have time to be precise about this. Hayes looked at his leg. She could see him running the actual calculation, not the bravado calculation, not the I'm fine calculation, the actual assessment of what his tibia and the soft tissue around his knee could do under load and for how long. 30 seconds, yes. A minute, probably. After that, it gets complicated. 30 seconds is enough. She positioned the gurney against the north door and looked at Rex. He'll walk beside? He'll walk beside. They moved. Hayes got his good leg under him and his bad leg at an angle that protected the fracture site, and she got her shoulder under his right arm, and they covered the 12 feet to the north door in a way that was neither clean nor easy, and that clearly cost Hayes something he chose not to vocalize, except as a single sharp exhale through his nose, when his bad leg took the brief moment of full weight it couldn't avoid. Rex walked exactly beside him, not underfoot, not pulling, 110 pounds of trained animal navigating a confined space with a precision that she would have found remarkable if she'd had the bandwidth to find anything remarkable. Through the door and into the north utility passage, which was concrete and pipes and a floor that sloped slightly toward a drain. The utility passage connected to the north stairwell, which connected to the ground floor north exit, which was the exit she'd routed Sandra's evacuation toward. Kerrigan appeared at the far end of the passage, coming from the stairwell. Alarm source? Mara said. Third floor, pull station near the east elevator bank. Nobody saw who. He looked at Hayes, then at Rex, then back at Mara. We have a problem. I know. The backup trigger. Not just that. He pulled out his phone and showed her something on the screen. She looked at it. It was a building schematic. Maple Crest General, all 4 floors, with several points marked in red. Our sweep team found 2 more access points. Not devices, preparation, brackets installed. Empty. Whatever was supposed to go in them wasn't placed. Because we interrupted them before they were finished, she said, or because the devices that go in them are still somewhere in the building, in the bag that your target in the basement was carrying, or the bag I kicked across the room, she said. The bag Ruiz secured, Kerrigan said, which contained components for 1 device, not 4. She looked at the schematic, at the 4 red points, at what they covered when you drew the pattern of the ductwork they connected to. This isn't about room 11, she said. No. It never was. Room 11 was the stated target, the one that made Hayes the explanation. She looked at the schematic again. These 4 points, plus the room 11 device, plus the stairwell panel, that's a dispersal grid. That's the whole building. A hospital with 112 patients, Kerrigan said. Why? It wasn't a question she was asking him. It was the question she was asking the situation. Hayes said there are 4 other members of his unit. He said he didn't know where they were transferred. She watched Kerrigan's face. Are any of them here? She said. In this building? The silence before he answered was 3 seconds too long. 1, he said. Floor 3. Transferred 2 days before Hayes under a different injury classification. We didn't connect them initially because the transfer records came through separate contractors. She stared at him. You're telling me there are 2 members of the same unit in this building, both transferred through civilian contractor channels, and nobody connected them until now. The contractor routing obscured the unit association. It was designed to. By who? Kerrigan's jaw tightened slightly. That's what we're working on. Aldridge, she said. That's the name Martinez gave. Something moved across his face. Not surprise. The opposite of surprise. The expression of someone hearing a word they'd been hoping not to hear for reasons they weren't yet in a position to explain. You know that name, she said. I know of it, he said carefully. It's not a person. It's a designator, a handler code used by a specific contractor network that was officially dissolved 18 months ago following an internal DOD review. 18 months. The same timeline the anonymous message had referenced. Rannoch Valley. The DOD review, she said. What triggered it? Kerrigan looked at Hayes. Hayes was listening with the focused quiet of someone piecing together a picture from parts he'd been holding separately. His face was careful. He was working. Hayes, Kerrigan said. Rannoch Valley. You were there. Hayes was quiet for 4 seconds. I can't confirm or deny Captain, Kerrigan's voice dropped. This isn't a classification issue anymore. This is a body count issue. The building has 2 members of your unit and a dispersal grid and someone with a backup trigger who just initiated a building evacuation. Tell me what happened at Rannoch Valley. Hayes looked at Mara. She didn't know why he looked at her specifically, except that she was the person in the passage who had spent the last 2 hours proving that her judgment was the thing standing between this building and something she didn't want to calculate. She gave him nothing, no pressure, no encouragement, just looked back. His call. Rannoch Valley was an off-books operation, Hayes said. 18 months ago, our unit was assigned to verify the location of a weapons cache that intelligence said was connected to a domestic procurement network. Not foreign. Domestic. He stopped for a beat. We found the cache. We also found documentation, procurement records, payment chains, contractor identification. The kind of documentation that implicated people inside the contracting network that had been supplying the DOD for 6 years. Aldridge, Kerrigan said. The designation was on 3 of the procurement documents. Yes. Hayes looked at the ceiling for a moment. We were told to extract the documentation and hold for further instruction. We did. And then the operation was officially classified at a level that meant none of us could discuss it with anyone outside the unit. The documentation was taken from us for processing, and 6 weeks later the DOD review was announced. He looked at Kerrigan. And now you're telling me that review was based on information that had already been sanitized. I'm telling you the review concluded with no actionable findings, Kerrigan said, which is not the same thing. And whoever ran the Aldridge network, Mara said, knows that the 5 members of Hayes's unit are the only people who saw the original documentation before it was sanitized, and knows that 2 of them are currently in this hospital. The building alarm was still cycling. In the corridor beyond the utility passage, she could hear feet, the controlled movement of an evacuation that was mostly complete, mostly away from here, mostly in the direction she'd routed it. Mostly. She thought about the south stairwell, about the panel she'd flagged, about whether Kerrigan's team had confirmed its clearance. The south stairwell panel, she said. Did Torres clear it? Kerrigan spoke into his radio. Waited. The response came back and she watched his face read it. Torres has been working the room 11 canister, he said. South stairwell wasn't confirmed. Who's on evacuation in the south corridor? I had 2 of my people routing through the north. Who's in the south? He spoke into the radio again. This time the pause before the response was longer. Hospital security, he said. 2 of Strom's people. Hospital security. People who answered to Gerald Strom, who was currently in his office with the silver-haired woman, who was... She realized she'd never gotten a name, never confirmed an agency, never actually verified who the silver-haired woman was, or who had sent her. "The woman with Strom," she said. "Who is she?" Kerrigan's expression shifted in a way that was small and controlled and that she read anyway. "Her credentials are federal. She came with the initial response authorization." "That's not what I asked." "She's an asset coordinator. She's been part of the response network for—" "Who authorized her specifically to be in this building?" The silence this time was different. It was the silence of a very competent person arriving at an answer they didn't like. "The authorization came through the same contractor routing as Hayes's transfer," Kerrigan said. "It flagged clean." "Aldridge designations flag clean," Mara said. "You told me the network was officially dissolved." "Officially dissolved networks don't disappear. They reroute." She was already moving toward the stairwell door because Strom's office was on the second floor and the second floor was where the south stairwell led out. And the south stairwell panel was uncleared and Gerald Strom was alone in a room with a woman whose authorization traced to the same contractor network that had planted devices in this building. And there was a backup trigger somewhere, and the evacuation had just moved the building's population away from the north and toward the south. "Donovan," Kerrigan's voice behind her. "Get Hayes and Rex to the north exit," she said. "Get your team to the south stairwell panel. Get someone to Strom's office now." She hit the stairwell door. "And figure out where the rest of the devices are, because there are 3 empty brackets in your schematic, and I count maybe 30 minutes before this building is empty enough that a dispersal has a clean run." She took the stairs at a speed that was informed by the fact that her body was running on adrenaline reserves. It had been drawing on for 2 hours, and that her jaw was telling her uncomfortable things, and that the practical reality of taking stairs fast in nursing clogs was that you managed it not through grace but through commitment. Second floor. She came through the stairwell door into the administrative corridor, which was quieter than the trauma floor. The administrative staff had evacuated early, desks empty, overhead lights half-dimmed on their automatic cycle. Strom's office was at the end of the hall, past the conference room, past the HR department's frosted glass door. The door was closed. She stopped 6 feet from it and listened. Voices. 2 of them, Strom and the woman. She could hear the register of both without the words, the way you heard conversation through a door. Normal volume. Conversational. She knocked and opened the door in the same motion, without waiting. Strom looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something he was increasingly uncomfortable with, and was trying to decide whether the interruption was a relief or an escalation. The silver-haired woman, she was standing near the window, not sitting, turned her head toward Mara with a quality of stillness that had nothing relaxed in it. "Donovan," Strom said, "this is really not the—" "There's a building evacuation in progress," Mara said. "You need to leave this office now, both of you." The woman said, "The evacuation is noted. Director Strom and I have just a few more minutes of—" "The south stairwell on this floor has an uncleared device in the electrical panel," Mara said. She was looking at the woman when she said it, and she was watching her face the way she watched things that mattered, and what she saw was not surprise. The woman's face produced a brief, controlled expression of surprise, the right shape, the right timing, and then settled back. That was the tell. Real surprise didn't settle. It sat in the face for a beat longer than performance allowed. "Director Strom," Mara said, and she kept her voice level, and she kept her eyes on the woman. "I need you to stand up and walk past me into the hallway and go to the north stairwell, right now. Don't take the elevator. Don't go toward the south." Strom was looking between them. I was not a stupid man. He was a limited man, a controlling man, a man who had spent 6 years confusing authority with competence. But he could read a room when the room became simple enough. The room had become simple enough. He stood up. The woman moved at the same time, not toward the door but toward the desk, toward the right side of the desk, where Strom's phone console sat, and her hand went to something that wasn't the phone console, something that had been placed beside it, a small black object that Mara recognized with the specific recognition of someone who had held one in a basement 40 minutes ago. She closed the distance in 2 steps and got her hand on the woman's wrist before the thumb made contact with the transmitter surface, and they struggled for the width of the desk. The woman stronger than she'd read her, training that was real and current behind the silver hair and the civilian clothes. And Mara was tired in a way she hadn't been 2 hours ago, and the woman knew exactly what she was doing. They went over the desk. Strom's monitor hit the floor, papers everywhere. The lamp went sideways and the room went to desk lamp on ceiling quality light, which was disorienting enough that Mara lost her angle for half a second, felt the woman's wrist pull free, and scrambled to get between her and the transmitter, which had landed on the carpet 2 feet from the desk. The woman's hand closed on it. Mara's hand closed on her hand. What happened next was not a fight. It was two people, one of them very tired and one of them not, holding the same 3-inch object with everything they had. And the outcome of it was going to be determined by physics and biology, and whichever set of reserves was less depleted. And there was about a 2-second window before that outcome was decided when Mara became aware of a sound in the doorway behind her. A sound she knew. A sound that was specifically and unmistakably the sound of a 110-pound Belgian Malinois who had been trained for exactly this kind of proximity threat, and who had a handler who had not, in fact, gone to the north exit, but had instead used his 30 seconds of weight-bearing capacity to get himself and his dog up one flight of stairs and into an administrative corridor. Rex came through the office doorway at a speed that was not compatible with the woman's ability to maintain her current position, and the transmitter hit the carpet, and Mara put her knee on the woman's arm, and Hayes came through the door behind Rex with his bad leg, and a corridor wall he'd been using as a rail, and the particular expression of a man who had made a decision that was going to cost him medically and had already accepted the cost. "Rex, hold," Hayes said. Rex held. The woman on the floor was breathing hard, one arm pinned, the other flat. She looked at the ceiling with an expression that was the first fully authentic expression Mara had seen on her face, which was the expression of someone running out of moves. Mara picked up the transmitter. She looked at it for a moment. She thought about the device still in the vent housing on the trauma floor, the canister she couldn't defuse herself, the receiver she'd removed and that Kerrigan had taken. She thought about whether a backup transmitter could operate on a different frequency from the primary, whether Torres had accounted for that, whether the isolation she'd achieved actually isolated. She pressed the transmitter's button. Nothing happened. She did the math on that, 2 seconds of very fast math, and decided the most likely explanation was that the receiver she'd removed was the only one, and the transmitter was now inoperative, and she was aware this was a probability calculation and not a certainty, and she was aware that she had been operating on probability calculations for the last 2 hours, and that they had held, and she chose to let that stand because the alternative was to keep holding the transmitter until someone with better equipment could test it, which was what she was going to do. She closed her hand around it and she looked at Hayes, who was leaning against the doorframe with Rex at his side and a level of pain in his face that he was managing through the same deliberate discipline she'd seen him apply to everything else. "I told you to go to the north exit," she said. "You did," he agreed. "Your leg is a problem I'll have tomorrow," he said. "Today it got us here." She looked at him for a moment, at Rex, at Strom, who was standing against the far wall with his hands slightly raised and his face doing something she'd never seen it do in 3 years, which was genuinely uncertain. At the woman on the floor, whose silver hair had come loose from its arrangement, and whose credentials, she was now entirely sure, were going to trace to a network that someone had been running inside the legitimate response infrastructure for longer than anyone currently in this room had known about. Her phone buzzed. She read the message from Kerrigan. "South stairwell panel cleared. Torres confirmed secondary device. Inert, never completed. 3 remaining brackets empty. No additional devices found. Building is secure." She read it again to make sure she'd read it right. Then she looked up at the room. Secure. A building that had been carrying a chemical dispersal device and 2 incomplete secondary setups and a fire alarm pulled by a woman currently on the floor of the director's office. And it was now, by Kerrigan's assessment, secure. She should have felt relief. She felt something more complicated than relief. The particular compound of exhaustion and alertness that happened when the threat dropped below the line and the body hadn't caught up yet with the news. Her jaw was swelling past comfortable. Her forearm had stopped hurting, which probably meant something she didn't want to think about yet. She had blood on her sleeve, dried now, that she'd forgotten about. She looked at the transmitter in her hand and thought about the message she'd received. Don't trust everyone in that building. She looked at Kerrigan's name on her phone screen, and then a sound from the hallway outside the office. Not from the south stairwell direction, not from north. From the elevator bank, which should not have been operational during an active evacuation, which standard building protocol locked out during alarm activation, which was locked out right now and had been since the alarm triggered. The elevator bank, from which a set of doors was opening. She heard it. Strom heard it. Hayes heard it, and Rex's head came around to face the hallway, and his ears went flat, and the sound that came from him was not a bark. It was the low, continuous alert that meant he was identifying something specific. Not a general threat. A person. A known individual. A person he had encountered before. Mara was in the doorway before she'd decided to move, and she was looking down the administrative corridor toward the elevator bank, and the doors were fully open, and the person stepping out of them was not one of Kerrigan's people, was not hospital staff, was not anyone she'd seen today. He was mid-50s, gray suit, the kind of face that existed in institutional spaces without being noticed, and he was carrying a case the size of a medical bag, and he stopped when he saw her, and in the half-second before his expression closed down into something controlled and official, she saw exactly what was behind it. And Rex kept making the sound. Not toward the man in the gray suit, toward the case in his hand. Rex didn't bark. That was the thing about a properly trained working dog that civilians never understood. The bark was for show, for warning, for the human benefit of an audible alert. The real alert was this: the low, continuous vocalization that wasn't aggression and wasn't uncertainty, but was the precise communication of a trained animal saying, "I have identified the specific threat I was taught to identify." And Rex had been making that sound since the elevator doors opened and had not stopped. The man in the gray suit had also not moved. He was standing 6 feet from the elevator with the medical bag in his right hand and the expression of someone who had walked into a situation that was substantially different from the one he'd prepared for. And he was doing the same thing Mara was doing, running the calculation, reading the room, counting the variables. She counted them faster. Kerrigan's team was on the trauma floor in the basement. Hayes was behind her in the office doorway, one leg compromised, using the frame as a support. The silver-haired woman was on the floor of the director's office, pinned by the situation, if not by anyone currently watching her. Strom was against the wall. The second-floor administrative corridor was empty of everyone except the people already in it. The man in the gray suit was between her and the north stairwell. "Step away from the elevator," she said. He looked at the bag in his hand. It was a deliberate look. Not checking what was inside, she didn't think, because he already knew. It was a communicative look. He was telling her something about the bag without saying it. "There's no version of this that improves for you in the next 60 seconds, she said. "Whatever's in the bag, Rex has already told me what it is. Put it on the floor." "You're the nurse," he said. His voice was even, mid-range, the voice of someone who had spent a career being neither memorable nor dismissible. "Donovan." "Put the bag on the floor." "The device in the ventilation housing is not the only one with a canister loaded," he said. "The bag has a secondary configuration. If I drop it, the impact—" "No, it doesn't," she said. He paused. "A pressure-sensitive secondary on a bag you're carrying into a building you intend to walk out of is a threat you're making, not a capability you actually have," she said. "If the bag drops on impact, you go with it. You're not here to die. You're here to finish something, which means the bag is a prop until you get to wherever you're going with it, and then it's a problem." She kept her eyes on his face. "So put it on the floor, and we can talk about what you actually came here to finish." Rex had not stopped the alert sound. It was getting on everyone's nerves, probably including Rex's. And it was also serving the purpose of keeping every person in earshot focused on the man in the gray suit in a way that made retreat complicated. The man looked at Mara for another 3 seconds. Then he set the bag on the floor with the careful deliberateness of someone who was making a choice rather than surrendering, which was a distinction that mattered to him and that she filed accordingly. "Back up 2 steps, she said. "Hands where I can see them." He backed up 2 steps. Hands visible. She crossed to the bag and crouched and looked at it without touching it, because she'd learned in a decade of doing this work that the first look was always more informative than the first touch. The bag was a standard medical transport case, hard-sided, with a combination latch. The latch was closed. The exterior had no obvious secondary mechanisms. The seam around the lid was straight, no deformation, no unusual weight distribution visible in how it had settled on the floor. She looked up at him. "Combination. 7421. She entered it, the latch released. She lifted the lid 2 centimeters and looked at the gap with the flashlight on her phone. No secondary. She opened it fully. Inside was a laptop, a hard drive, a sealed USB drive in a static bag, and a manila envelope with a military document classification stamp across the top that had been partially redacted with a black marker, but not carefully enough because the stamp code underneath was still legible in two places if you held it at the right angle. No canister, no device, no chemical component of any kind. She looked up at him again. "I wasn't here to place a device," the man said quietly. "I was here to pull one out." His name was Warren Price. She didn't know that in the first 5 minutes. She knew it when Kerrigan came up from the trauma floor and looked at him and said the name with the particular quality of someone identifying a face from a file they'd read 3 years ago and hadn't expected to see in person. Price received this without surprise and without the defensive posture of someone who'd been caught. He received it the way someone received news they'd been waiting for. He was, Kerrigan explained, in a low voice in the administrative corridor. While Ruiz kept eyes on Price, and Torres was on the phone behind a closed door, a former DoD procurement auditor who had been part of the internal review process that examined the Aldridge contractor network 18 months ago. He had been, officially, one of the review's investigators. He had been, unofficially and in ways the review had never established, the person inside the review who had been feeding information to the network about what the review was finding and what it was about to find. He had also, and this was the part that Kerrigan delivered in a voice that was very flat and very careful, been the person who had flagged Hayes's unit as the source of the original documentation, the documentation that had started the chain. He fed them the unit members' locations, Mara said. "That's what we're working from, yes. And now he's here with a hard drive and classified documents." "Yes." "Voluntary?" Kerrigan looked at Price, who was sitting against the corridor wall with Ruiz standing 2 feet away and Rex sitting 4 feet beyond that, still watching him with the fixed attention of an animal that had not yet been told to stand down. He came through the elevator, not the stairwell. He could have taken the north stairs and been on this floor before any of us knew he was in the building. He didn't. He came where you'd see him. She thought about that. He wanted to be stopped. Or he wanted to be in the same room as the people he'd been working against for 18 months and have something to show for it. Kerrigan looked at the bag on the floor, which Torres had now taken custody of. The documents in that case, the classification stamp you saw. If they're what I think they are, they're a duplicate set. Not the originals that Hayes's unit recovered, a second copy that Price held back from the official review process. Mara looked at Price, at the side of his face. He was looking at the wall, not at anyone in particular, with the focused interior expression of someone doing a calculation that had nothing to do with the immediate room. He held back evidence, she said, and he sat on it for 18 months, Kerrigan said, while the network moved, while they placed people in contractor routing positions, while they identified Hayes's unit and started building a plan to eliminate the witnesses. He paused. And then something shifted. What shifted? One of the network's contractors made a mistake, 18 days ago. A payment routing that Price had flagged internally and that got buried. It reappeared in a different channel, which meant the network was still active, which meant the threat to Hayes's unit was still active, which meant Price's 18 months of holding back had become a decision he couldn't maintain. She looked at the bag, at the classified stamp, at the chain of choices a person could make across 18 months, that started with compromise and ended with a hard drive in a medical case in an evacuated hospital corridor. He still fed them the locations, she said, even if he's here to stop it. Yes, Kerrigan said. He did. She nodded. That was all. Some things didn't require more than a nod. The formal federal response arrived at Maple Crest General at 4:17 in the afternoon, 43 minutes after the building alarm had been triggered, and 9 minutes after Kerrigan made a series of phone calls from the second-floor conference room that he made alone with the door closed. 2 vehicles parked in the north lot. 4 agents in jackets that said nothing on them, which said everything. A 5th person who wore civilian clothes and carried credentials that she was shown briefly and that she held the right way. The way people held credentials they'd looked at enough times to have stopped needing to read them carefully. The silver-haired woman was removed from Strom's office. She didn't speak when they walked her out. She had the posture of someone who was doing the math on available options and had arrived at silence as the best of them. Price was removed separately, with a different quality of handling. Not gentle, but not the grip of someone who'd already made a determination. The distinction was visible if you knew what to look for. Mara watched from the administrative corridor. Her jaw had progressed from throbbing to a dull, insistent pressure that was going to require imaging at some point, but was not going to get it today. Her forearm she'd wrapped herself using supplies from the trauma floor cart, gauze and a tensor bandage, not perfect. Enough. Strom had not been removed. He had been asked to remain in his office with one of the jacketed agents, and he had complied with the particular compliance of a man who had suddenly understood that the scale of events around him was well beyond anything his position of authority could affect. She watched him walk back into his office with his shoulders carrying something they hadn't been carrying that morning, and she did not feel satisfaction about it because it wasn't satisfaction that she felt. It was the complicated non-feeling of someone who had worked beside a person for 3 years and had been dismissed by them, and had just watched those same 3 years resolve into something neither of them had been prepared for. Hayes was in the conference room with his leg elevated on a second chair, and Rex beside him, and a trauma kit that Mara had brought from the supply corridor, because his IV line had been pulled somewhere between the supply corridor and the office doorway, and the site was weeping slightly and needed cleaning. She sat across from him and did the work, and neither of them talked for a few minutes because there wasn't a version of the conversation that needed to happen immediately. "The other unit member," she said eventually. "Floor 3. "Sergeant Waverly," Hayes said. "She came through 2 days before me. Different injury, different entry point. They told me she'd been transferred to a different facility." His jaw tightened briefly. "They told me that on day 1. "She's still here." "Apparently." He looked at the window. "They lied to me about where my own people were." "The contractor routing," she said. "It was designed to keep you from knowing your unit was being consolidated." "Consolidated in a building that was being prepared for a dispersal event," he said. "Yes. I've been sitting with that for the last hour." She finished cleaning the IV site and applied a dressing. "Waverly is okay. Kerrigan confirmed she's on floor 3, stable, unaware of most of what happened down here." "Someone's going to have to tell her." "Someone is." Hayes looked at her. "Not my place," she said. "She's your unit." He nodded. He looked at his leg, at the brace, at the particular reality of a man who had gotten himself up a flight of stairs on a fractured tibia and was now reassessing the interest rate on that decision. "What's the damage?" "I'm a trauma nurse, not an orthopedic surgeon." She looked at the brace. "The fracture site is stable, as far as I can tell without imaging. You may have displaced the reduction depending on what you put through it in the last hour. You're going to need a new scan and probably a surgical consult, and you're going to have a conversation with an orthopedic surgeon who is going to be deeply unhappy with you." "I've had that conversation before." "I know," she said. "That doesn't make it shorter." The corner of his mouth moved. Rex put his chin on Hayes's knee, and Hayes dropped his hand to the dog's head without looking. The automatic gesture of two beings that had been in enough rooms together to have their own language. Mara sat back in her chair. She was aware that the adrenaline was metabolizing, that the specific kind of clarity that came with sustained threat response was beginning to resolve into its aftermath, which was a different kind of awareness, duller, heavier, made of things she'd been setting aside for 2 hours because there hadn't been space to hold them. The smell of the basement, the particular sound of a human body against a concrete floor. The 9 minutes at the ventilation housing with her hands inside a device that she'd been telling herself for 3 years she no longer needed to know how to approach. "You haven't asked me why I left," she said. Hayes looked at her. "EOD, 8 years, 3 tours. You haven't asked." "No," he said. "Most people ask." "Most people want the version that makes sense to them," he said. "I don't need it to make sense to me." She looked at the table, at the edge of the dressing she'd just applied. "One of my team members died on a disposal call in Kandahar, 3rd tour. It wasn't a failure of procedure. It wasn't bad intelligence. It was the specific bad luck of a device that had been modified after our last sweep of the area and before we went back in." She kept her voice even, factual, the way she always kept it when she talked about it, which was almost never. "I was 50 meters out running a secondary perimeter check. He was at the device. The calculation we'd made together, using all the information we had, was sound. The device was different from what the calculation assumed." She looked up. "I was 50 meters out, so I'm here. He wasn't, so he isn't." Hayes was quiet. "After that, I couldn't make the calculation anymore," she said. "Not because I didn't trust the process. Because I trusted the process completely, and understood exactly what that meant about outcomes. She looked at her hands, at the nitrile gloves she'd been putting on and taking off for 2 hours. Nursing is a different calculation. The variables are different. The margins are different. But you still make it, he said, every shift. And today? She thought about the 9 minutes at the housing, about the right side of the bracket, about the moment the receiver came free. Today I made it. Yes, he said. You did. The formal debriefing began at 6 in the evening in the conference room, which had been cleared and set up with a recording device and a table of people that included Kerrigan, 2 of the jacketed agents, the civilian clothes woman with the credentials, and a man introduced only as a DOD special investigator named Ferris, who had the build of someone who had been active duty at some point, and the patience of someone who had spent the subsequent years dealing with the consequences of active duty decisions made by other people. Mara sat across from Ferris and gave him everything in order, beginning with the moment Rex had frozen in room 11. She did not editorialize. She did not manage her presentation. She had learned in 8 years of military service that a clear, sequential account of events was the only useful kind, and that anything added to make it more comprehensible was usually just noise that made it less accurate. Ferris listened without interrupting. The recording device ran. Halfway through, she put the transmitter on the table. He looked at it, picked it up, turned it over. You pressed this? Yes. In the director's office after you'd secured the woman? Yes. Knowing the receiver had been removed but not fully certain the isolation was complete? Yes. He looked at her. What made you press it? I needed to know if it worked, she said, and I needed to know before I handed it to someone else to figure out, because if it worked and I handed it to the wrong person, the conversation we'd be having right now would be different. Ferris put the transmitter down. What's your assessment of the woman? Current, well-trained. The silver hair is real. She's mid-50s. The credentials were clean enough to pass initial review, which means she had access to whoever generates those. The hesitation she showed when I mentioned the South Stairwell panel was performed. She already knew about the panel, and she was performing not knowing. That's a specific skill set. Mara paused. She's not a contractor. She's career. Career what? I don't know what designation, but the way she moved, the way she assessed, that's not a woman who spent her career in logistics or coordination. That's operational background. Ferris made a note. And Price, she said. He came to end it. I believe that. It doesn't cancel what he did 18 months ago, but I think the distinction matters for what you're trying to build. You're not in a position to... I know I'm not, she said. I'm telling you what I saw. What you build from it is yours. Ferris looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone revising an estimate. He wrote something. She didn't ask what. The debriefing ran 2 hours. By the end of it, the building had been fully cleared. The ventilation device had been removed by an actual hazmat team. The south stairwell panel had been confirmed inert and removed, and the 3 empty brackets had been photographed and documented. The man from the basement, whose name turned out to be Voss, which appeared in federal records under 3 different contractor designations going back 7 years, was in federal custody. Martinez was in federal custody. The silver-haired woman, who had a name that Mara was told but that she was not cleared to write down, was in federal custody. Price had been transported separately, to somewhere Kerrigan described only as appropriate. Gerald Strom had spent 4 hours in his office with agents, and had emerged looking like a man who had answered questions that cost him things he hadn't known he'd had to lose. He walked past Mara in the administrative corridor at 8 in the evening, and he stopped. She waited. They're saying you identified the devices, he said, and secured the basement, and the woman in my office. Some of those things, yes. He looked at her in the way people looked when they were doing a recalculation they should have done earlier and knew it. I sent you up there to deliver paperwork. You did. I didn't... He stopped, started again. I didn't know what you were. No, she said. You didn't. The thing she noticed was that he didn't say he should have. He was a man who could stand in a corridor and understand, in this specific moment, the full weight of what he hadn't known. But he didn't have the language for what came after that understanding, and she wasn't going to hand it to him. Some things people had to find themselves, or not find. He nodded once and walked away. Sandra caught her at the nurse's station at 8:15. The trauma floor had been partially restored. 3 patients reoccupied rooms, the monitoring equipment running again, the overhead lights at full. It looked almost normal if you didn't look at the ceiling above room 11, which had a new panel and fresh screws and a faint smell of machine oil that the ventilation system had not yet cycled through. "You need imaging on that jaw," Sandra said. "I know. And the arm. I know. Are you going to get it?" Mara looked at the nurse's station, at the monitors and the clipboards and the particular organized normalcy of a workplace that had been through something and was quietly rebuilding its routines because that was what workplaces did. "After shift," she said. Sandra looked at her for a long moment. "You were here before any of them," she said. "Before the people in the jackets, before the federal response. You were already in the building running it." "I was already in the building delivering paperwork," Mara said. Sandra didn't smile. "No, you weren't," she said. "You never were." She turned back to the station. "Go get your jaw looked at, Donovan." It was Ferris who found her at 9 in the evening, when she was sitting in the supply corridor on the gurney she'd used to transport Hayes, which was still there because nobody had moved it back. She was sitting on it with her feet on the floor and her hands in her lap, not doing anything, which was a thing she'd been building toward for about 3 hours and had finally arrived at. He came in and looked at the space and pulled the equipment stool from the supply rack and sat on it, which was a choice that said something about him. "Hayes's unit," he said, "all 5 members. We've confirmed all locations now, 2 in this building, 2 in other facilities, both civilian contractor routed, both in facilities that were subsequently identified as having access points. Preparation work, not completed devices. 1 member in a secure location that was never compromised. Which means whoever was building this was working with incomplete information," she said. "Or running out of time," he said. "The payment routing error that Price identified 18 days ago. That was the accelerant. The network was beginning to feel pressure it couldn't locate, moving faster than was safe." "Mistakes." "Yes." He looked at her hands. "The documents in Price's case have been authenticated. They match the classification structure of the original Rannoch Valley documentation. They're not identical. These were compiled separately over the 18 months, but they corroborate the procurement records, the payment chains, and the Aldridge designations." He paused. 3 individuals named in those documents are currently in positions within the DoD contractor oversight system. She looked at him. "Currently. As of this morning. And now? Now there are conversations happening that will resolve that." He said it the way someone said something that was true and insufficient at the same time, and he seemed to know it. "It won't be fast. That's not how this works." "What happens to Hayes's unit?" "Their records regarding Rannoch Valley will be formally reviewed. The classification that prevented them from discussing it will be subject to a legal challenge based on the new documentation. That's a process." He looked at the wall. "But it's a process that's now actually running, which is different from 18 months ago." She nodded. "The woman in Strom's office," he said. "Your assessment that she was operational, not administrative, that was correct. She was running the contractor network's internal security function. She's been in place for 6 years. 6 years. Mara thought about that. About how many decisions had moved through that network in 6 years. About how many access points. About how many buildings, with panels and brackets, and people who didn't know what was above their ceiling. "I need to ask you something," Ferris said. "And I want you to know that you're under no obligation and that the answer doesn't affect anything currently in motion." She waited. "Your EOD background, your military record, the specific knowledge you applied in this building today." He looked at her steadily. "There's a unit operating under the DoD Special Investigations Branch that is specifically structured to address contractor network infiltration in civilian medical infrastructure. They've been building their roster for 14 months. They have a gap in the EOD specialist position that has been difficult to fill." The supply corridor was quiet. The building had settled into the particular quiet of an institution that had had something happen and was processing it the way institutions did, slowly, in the background, room by room. She looked at her hands, at the tensor bandage on her forearm, at the nitrile gloves folded in her scrub pocket. "I'm a trauma nurse," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are." "I chose that deliberately." "I know." "And I'm not saying no," she said. "I'm saying I need to think about it without someone in the room waiting for the answer." Ferris stood up from the equipment stool. "That's fair. He put a card on the gurney beside her. No agency name, just a number. When you're ready, if you're ready, he moved toward the door. For what it's worth, the gap in the roster has been open 14 months. It can keep being open. He left. She looked at the card for a moment, then she picked it up and put it in the same pocket as the gloves. Outside the supply corridor, she heard Rex, not the alert sound, not the tracking vocalization, but the ordinary sound of a dog moving on a hard floor, nails clicking, the particular rhythm of an animal that had done its job and was now simply moving with its person. She heard Hayes's uneven gait behind it, the asymmetry of someone managing a fractured tibia who had made a decision he was going to pay for orthopedically for a while and had chosen not to mind. She heard them stop outside the supply corridor door. Donovan, Hayes's voice through the door. Yeah. Waverly's awake. She wants to meet the nurse who apparently ran a 2-person EOD response with a dog and an IV line. Mara looked at the ceiling. I had more than an IV line. What did you have? She thought about it, about what she'd had exactly, walking through this door 4 hours ago, which was nitrile gloves and a badge and a contact list. She hadn't deleted in the specific muscle memory of someone who had learned the hard way. What difference was between a problem and a solution? A head start, she said. A pause. Are you going to come out of there? She stood up from the gurney. She straightened her scrubs. She looked at the door. In her pocket, the card sat beside the gloves, and the gloves sat beside the transmitter she'd forgotten to hand back to anyone and that nobody had come looking for, and the transmitter sat inert in the dark beside everything else she was carrying that didn't have a name yet, but would, eventually, given enough time and enough of the kind of clarity that came from doing the work that was directly in front of you until the larger picture assembled itself into something you could read. She opened the door, but before she could step through it, her phone buzzed one more time, and this time the number wasn't the anonymous sender from the basement, and it wasn't Kerrigan, and it wasn't Ferris. It was a number she recognized because it was in her contacts under a code she'd assigned it herself 7 years ago, belonging to the one person from Bravo team who had never been listed in any official record as having survived the 3rd tour in Kandahar. The same person whose name appeared in the official casualty documentation she'd been shown on a base in Germany the week before she filed her separation papers. The person who was, by every record she had ever been allowed to see, dead. The message said, I saw what you did today. We need to talk about who knew I was still alive and why they needed Hayes's unit to disappear. She stood in the supply corridor doorway with the phone in her hand and read the message twice, not because she didn't understand it the first time, but because the brain required 2 passes at information that fundamentally restructured something it had already filed as resolved. Tomas Reyes had been dead for 3 years. She had a document that said so. She had a casualty notification she'd received in Germany, typed on official letterhead, with a case reference number and a signature from a base commander she'd met twice, and a date that corresponded to the 4th day of her last month in country. She had attended a memorial. She had watched a flag get folded. She had carried the specific weight of his name in the part of her that kept count of the people she'd worked beside and couldn't account for anymore. She had not deleted his number because deleting a dead person's number felt like a second erasure, and she hadn't been able to do it, and she had not examined that decision too carefully because some things you just left alone. Her thumb hovered over the reply field. She typed, Where are you? The response came in 11 seconds. Parking structure, North Lot, Level 2, blue pickup. Come alone. I know that sounds exactly as bad as it does. She looked at the door, at Hayes beyond it, and Rex, and the floor of a building that had been through enough today that she could reasonably argue she owed it nothing more. She thought about Ferris's card in her pocket, about Kerrigan somewhere in the building with his team running down the final threads of a network that had spent 18 months building towards something it had not managed to finish. She thought about the name on the casualty notification, about the way official paperwork could be the most precise instrument in the world, and also in the hands of the right institutional pressure, a tool for making people disappear in either direction. She typed, Give me 5 minutes. She stepped back into the corridor. Hayes was leaning against the wall outside, Rex at his side, and he read something in her face that made him straighten slightly despite the cost. What happened? He said. Not a question. I need to go to the north parking structure. She looked at him. Alone. For a few minutes. That's a sentence that doesn't have a good following sentence. I know. She looked at the phone in her hand. I need to tell Kerrigan something first, and then I need you to let me do this. Is it connected to what happened today? Yes. She paused. And to something before today that I thought was finished. Hayes looked at her for the particular length of time that a person looked at someone when they were deciding whether to trust their judgment versus their own instinct, and she could see the instinct clearly. The same instinct that had gotten him up a staircase on a fractured tibia, the one that moved toward the problem instead of away from it. She watched him make the same choice he'd made in room 11 when she'd told him to stay on the call button, and he'd stayed. 5 minutes, he said. 5 minutes, she agreed. She found Kerrigan in the conference room and told him Reyes's name and showed him the message. She watched his face process it, the initial blankness of someone encountering a variable that doesn't fit the current model, followed by the reorientation of someone whose model was, in this specific moment, good enough to accommodate a new variable without rejecting it. The casualty documentation, he said. Official, signed, reference numbered. I have no reason to believe it was forged except that I'm holding a message from the person it describes. It could be someone using the number. It could be, she said. Kerrigan looked at the message. The content references specific knowledge, who knew Hayes's unit, who needed them to disappear. He looked up. That's not something you say to a stranger. No. I'm going to need to be there. I told him alone. I'll be visible from the parking structure entrance, not at the vehicle. He held her look. If it's Reyes, he'll understand. If it's not, you need a line. It was a reasonable position. She didn't argue it. The north parking structure at Maple Crest General was 4 levels, half empty at 9 in the evening, with the particular dead fluorescent quality of covered parking at night, pools of yellow light separated by long stretches of shadow, the smell of concrete and exhaust, and the cold that came off the mountains after dark in November. Level 2 had 8 cars on it. She saw the blue pickup against the far wall, backed in, facing the ramp, the way someone parked when they wanted to see what was coming. She walked toward it with her hands visible and her pace even, and Kerrigan behind her at the structure entrance, far enough that he was a shape against the light and not a presence at her shoulder. The driver's door opened when she was 20 feet out. Tomas Reyes was 41 years old, and he looked like a man who had spent 3 years not sleeping in places that were cold. He was thinner than she remembered, with a beard she'd never seen on him because he'd kept it clean through 3 tours as a point of personal discipline, and there were lines in his face that hadn't been there. He stood beside the truck, and he looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and found, now that it was happening, that the rehearsal had been inadequate. She stopped 6 feet from him. "You're alive," she said. "Yeah." His voice was the same. Lower register, the Albuquerque accent she'd always been able to hear under his military cadence. "I'm sorry. I know what the notification said." "You know what the notification said?" she repeated, not as an accusation, just to hear it. "It wasn't my choice. I need you to know that first." "Tell me the rest," she said. "Then I'll tell you what I know." He talked for 20 minutes. She let him, which was a choice she made consciously because the information in the middle mattered more than whatever she felt about the information at the edges, and she was tired enough that sorting the two would require the kind of focused attention that talking didn't allow. The short version, condensed from 20 minutes of a man working his way through 3 years of accumulated context, Reyes had not died in Kandahar. He had been pulled from the field, officially listed as KIA, and run through a process that he described with the controlled language of someone who had been extensively briefed on how to describe it. A protected witness protocol that existed within a DoD Special Programs office, and that had no official name in any document he'd been shown. He had been told his extraction was necessary because of what Bravo team had recovered in a compound 2 days before the disposal call. Documentation, payment records, procurement chains. And because someone inside the contractor network had identified him specifically as having handled the documentation directly and had communicated an intent that the Special Programs Office assessed as credible. They had faked his death, put him in a location he was not permitted to disclose, maintained the protocol for 18 months, during which the official DoD review ran and concluded and was buried, and the network recalibrated, and the 4 surviving members of Bravo team moved through their post-service lives unaware that one of their own was alive in a box somewhere being told it was for his protection. 3 weeks ago, the same payment routing error that had reached Price had reached the Special Programs Office, and the specific officer managing Reyes' protocol had made a decision, not an authorized decision. He was clear about that. A unilateral decision made by a person who had been watching the network move for months and had concluded that the protocol was no longer protecting Reyes. It was simply containing him while the people who wanted him dead rebuilt their position. That officer had given Reyes a phone, a vehicle, and an address. The address was Maple Crest General. "He told you to come here," Mara said. "He told me someone in this building was the best chance of stopping what was moving," Reyes said. "He didn't tell me it would be you." A pause. "When I saw your name on the building staff list, I thought, you thought it was a coincidence. I thought it was the universe being strange." He looked at her steadily. "And then I watched what happened today from the parking structure, on the security feed the officer had access to, and I stopped thinking it was strange." She looked at him, at the 3 years of weight in his face, at the beard, at the truck backed in facing the exit. "Who is the officer?" He told her. She held the name in her head for a moment, and then she took out her phone and called Kerrigan. He answered on the first ring. She gave him the name. There was a pause on the other end that was the same quality as the pause she'd felt in herself. The restructuring of a model, the accommodation of a new variable. Then Kerrigan said, "Hold where you are," and she could hear him moving. She lowered the phone and looked at Reyes. "The people who built that documentation," she said. "Aldridge. The network that's been running inside contractor oversight for 6 years. The woman from the director's office. Voss from the basement. The coordination structure behind all of it. Do you know the architecture?" "I know the architecture," he said. "I've had 18 months to think about nothing else." "Then you have more than Price's documents." "Yes." "And Ferris's investigation has been working from incomplete information." "Yes." She looked at the parking structure exit where Kerrigan would be coming through in the next 90 seconds. At the fluorescent pools on the concrete floor. At Reyes, who was alive, which was a fact she had not yet fully processed and was not going to be able to process quickly, and which was a problem for a time when she wasn't standing in a parking structure at 9 in the evening with a building full of federal agents 20 meters away. "You're going to have to come inside," she said. "I know. It won't be comfortable." "I know that too." He looked at her. "Mara, I'm sorry about—" "Don't," she said, not harshly. "Not now. Later, when we're not in a parking structure and this is over, we can do that conversation. Right now I need you to come inside and tell these people everything you know." He nodded. He looked at the truck, at the parking structure, at the exit ramp, and whatever was past it in the direction of not this. She watched him look at it and then look away from it, and the decision was on his face when he turned back. "Okay," he said. Kerrigan came through the entrance with one of the jacketed agents behind him, and the expression on his face when he saw Reyes was the most human expression she'd seen from him all day. Not quite shock, something quieter and more complicated than shock. The expression of someone absorbing something that shouldn't be possible and deciding to treat it as information rather than an event. He took Reyes inside. She followed. The next 4 hours were the kind of hours that happened after everything else. The accounting hours. The documentation hours. The hours in which the story stopped being made and started being assembled into a shape that could be carried forward. Reyes sat in the conference room with Ferris and 2 additional investigators, who arrived at 11 and whom she recognized by their manner as the specific kind of federal presence that came when the scale of something had been revised upward significantly. He talked for 3.5 hours. She knew this because she was in the corridor outside for most of it, not invited in, which was correct. She'd given what she had. What Reyes carried was different in kind and quantity, and what it built when combined with Price's documents and the physical evidence from the building was something she could feel the shape of from the corridor without needing to be inside the room. It was the shape of a case, an actual, prosecutable, public case, not a classified review with no actionable findings. A case. At 1:15 in the morning, Ferris came out of the conference room and found her sitting on the floor of the corridor with her back against the wall and her legs extended and her eyes open in the particular way of someone who is awake out of commitment rather than alertness. He sat down on the floor beside her, which again said something about him. The documents Price carried, combined with Reyes's direct testimony and the physical evidence recovered from this building, give us enough to proceed against 9 individuals, he said. 3 inside DoD contractor oversight, 4 within the Aldridge Network's operational structure, and 2 that we hadn't previously identified who appear to be senior enough that I'm not going to say their positions out loud in a hospital corridor. She looked at the ceiling. The woman from the director's office will cooperate, he said. She's already indicated as much through her attorney, who made contact approximately an hour ago. She's been doing this long enough to know what her options look like. And Voss? Voss has said nothing and will probably say nothing. But Voss doesn't need to say anything. We have the physical evidence, and we have Martinez, and we have the building's security footage, which shows him in the maintenance uniform on 3 separate cameras over 2 days. And Strom, she said. Ferris was quiet for a moment. Strom is complicated, he said. There's no evidence he knew the nature of what had access to his building. There's substantial evidence that he created administrative conditions, access protocols, vendor oversight gaps, documentation practices that made it significantly easier for the network to operate. Whether that rises to criminal negligence or just profound institutional failure is going to be a legal question. He paused. He's already resigned, as of 40 minutes ago. She absorbed that. She thought about Strom walking past her in the corridor, about the thing he hadn't been able to say, about 3 years of being treated as the most controllable employee in the building. There was no satisfaction in it. There was a kind of grim arithmetic, the specific ledger of a person who had confused authority with insight for long enough that he'd missed the thing hiding in plain sight inside his own institution, and now the institution was going to have to absorb the consequences of that. The special programs officer who gave Reyes the truck and the address, she said. Acting outside his authorization, Ferris said, which is a serious problem. A pause. Which is also, given the outcome, a problem that has significant competing factors. He looked at the floor. That determination is above my level. But Reyes is out of the protocol. Officially as of tonight, yes. His status will be revised and the casualty documentation corrected. He looked at her. That includes notifying his family, which, his mother, she said, Albuquerque. She thinks he's dead. Yes. She looked at the corridor, at the fluorescent light, at the fire suppression sprinkler head on the ceiling that was just a fire suppression sprinkler head, nothing else, no story in it. Someone should tell her in person, not a phone call. I agree, Ferris said. We're making arrangements. They sat on the floor for a moment without talking, which was the most honest thing available. The building around them was quieter than it had been at any point today. The night shift had taken over, the patients were stable, the federal response had settled into its documentation phase, and Maple Crest General was doing the thing that places did after being the site of something. It was becoming a place again, slowly, room by room. Your answer, Ferris said, the roster position. I know. You don't have to, I know I don't. She looked at the ceiling again. I left because I couldn't make the calculation anymore, because I understood the process completely, and that understanding didn't protect anyone, including me. She let that sit for a second. Today I made the calculation. In a building I'd worked in for 3 years, with equipment I improvised, without a team or authorization or any of the things the process is supposed to require. She turned her head to look at him. And the calculation held. Not because I'm better than I was in Kandahar, because the building was still standing and that was what was required. And I'm still a nurse, she said. I want to be clear about that. That's not a cover, and it's not a consolation. It's what I chose, and it's who I am. Ferris nodded. But the gap in your roster, she said. If the specific function is identifying contractor network infiltration in civilian medical infrastructure, then the person who fills it should be someone who actually works in civilian medical infrastructure. Not someone who visits it, not someone who assesses it from the outside. She looked at him. I want to know if there's a version where I keep my nursing position and the role is structured around it. Real shifts, real patients, real floor work. She paused. And on the other side of that, the work you're describing. Ferris was quiet for a long moment. That's not how the position was designed. I know. Can it be redesigned? He looked at her with the expression of someone doing a different kind of calculation. Not a threat assessment, not an operational one, but the calculation of a person asking themselves whether the shape of something they'd built was the right shape or just the familiar one? I don't know, he said honestly. I'd have to make a case for it. Then make the case, she said, and let me know what the answer is. She stood up from the floor in the way of someone whose body had significant opinions about the day it had been through and was registering all of them simultaneously. She straightened her scrubs. She looked at the corridor. I'm going to go check on my patients, she said. Hayes was in room 11. They'd put him back there at his request. The room had been cleared, the new panel installed, the air quality checked twice by the hazmat team and declared clean. It smelled of machine oil and fresh sealant, and the particular staleness of a room that had been vacated and reoccupied within the same day, which was not a comfortable smell but was not a dangerous one. Rex was on the floor beside the bed. He lifted his head when she came in and then put it back down, which was the dog equivalent of acknowledgement without obligation. Hayes was awake. He had the look of someone who had been lying in a hospital bed for 2.5 days and had been through significantly more than lying in a hospital bed, and who was operating at the specific intersection of exhaustion and too much information to sleep. She checked the IV site, checked the brace, checked his vitals from the monitor because that was her job, and she was doing her job. Reyes, Hayes said. She looked at him. Kerrigan told me, he said, briefly. Yeah. He's alive. He's alive. Hayes looked at the ceiling. Something moved through his face that was not one thing. It was the specific complex thing that happened when you received information that restructured 3 years of a particular kind of grief that you'd learned to carry and had come to treat as permanent. She'd felt it in the parking structure, and she felt it again, watching it move through him, and she didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that was better than silence. The rest of the unit, he said eventually. Waverly, the others. Kerrigan is handling notifications and security review for all 4. You'll have contact information by morning. He nodded. Rex made the small sound he made in half sleep, the canine version of processing. They're going to want statements, Hayes said. All of us. About Rannoch Valley. About what we found. Yes. And this time it's going to go somewhere. She thought about the conference room, about the 9 names Ferris had given her, about the case that was assembling itself from Price's documents and Reyes's testimony, and the physical evidence that had been collected from the ventilation housing and the basement and the supply brackets and the secondary mechanical room. Yes, she said, this time it's going to go somewhere. He looked at her for a moment. What are you going to do? Tonight, finish my shift. After tonight. She thought about Ferris's card, about the question of whether a position could be redesigned, about a nursing floor and the work of keeping people in the world, and the specific different work of making sure the world stayed safe enough to keep them in. I don't fully know yet, she said. I know what I'm not going to do. Which is? Disappear again. She looked at the window, at the November dark beyond it. I spent 3 years here being the person nobody thought to ask about, being easy to overlook. Some of that was deliberate. I chose it because I needed to be somewhere quiet after Kandahar. But somewhere along the way, quiet became invisible, and invisible became, she paused, looking for the right word, a kind of agreement. An agreement that I was just the nurse who delivered paperwork and didn't push back and could be managed. She looked at Hayes. I'm not making that agreement anymore. You weren't making it today, he said. No, today I wasn't. She checked the IV rate one more time because she always checked it twice. But today isn't enough. Today is one day. The agreement I'm talking about is the one you make every morning when you walk into a place and decide who you are in it. Hayes looked at her steadily. You know what you are. I'm starting to remember, she said. She moved toward the door. Rex's tail moved once against the floor. Not a wag, just a gesture, the way a working dog communicated things it didn't need to make large. Donovan, Hayes said. She turned. Whatever they offer you. Whatever the structure is. He held her look. Make them build it right. Don't take the version that's convenient for them. She thought about that. About Ferris saying I don't know with the honesty of someone who meant it. And about the fact that I don't know was the beginning of a negotiation, not the end of one. I'll make them build it right, she said. She walked out into the corridor. The sun came up over Harlow, Colorado at 6:47 on a Friday morning in November, which was 12 hours and 31 minutes after a Belgian Malinois had pressed flat against a hospital floor and looked at a ventilation panel and changed the shape of everything that followed. The light was the thin, cold, early winter light that came at that angle. The kind that didn't warm anything immediately but made the edges of things very clear. The roofline of the building, the ridgeline of the mountains past the interstate, the particular geometry of a parking structure where a man who had been officially dead for 3 years had sat in a blue pickup truck and waited. Mara finished her shift at 7. She changed out of her scrubs and put on her coat and walked to the north exit, which was the exit she'd routed the evacuation through the night before, the one with no south stairwell panel and no compromised access points and no decisions still in motion. She stopped at the door and looked back at the building. In 4 weeks, the formal federal indictments would be unsealed and the names of 9 individuals, 3 within DoD contractor oversight, 4 within the operational structure of the Aldridge network, and 2 whose positions were senior enough that Ferris had been unwilling to say them aloud in a corridor, would be made public in a document that ran to 63 pages and that cited, among its evidentiary sources, the physical recovery of chemical dispersal components from a trauma center ventilation system in Harlow, Colorado, and the testimony of a military witness who had been officially listed as deceased for 36 months. The document would not name Mara Donovan. It would reference, in 3 separate footnotes, an unidentified civilian hospital worker whose interventions had been assessed as directly preventing a mass casualty event. She would read those footnotes on a Thursday evening in her apartment and feel something specific about being a footnote, and then she would set the document down and make herself dinner, because some reckonings happened loudly and some happened in kitchens on Thursday nights, and both were real. In 6 weeks, Gerald Strom's resignation would become official, and Maple Crest General would begin the process of finding a new director under a board that was itself under federal oversight review. Sandra would be asked to serve as interim director of nursing operations, a role she would accept without celebration and perform with the competence of someone who had been doing the job without the title for 11 years. In 8 weeks, the Special Programs Office's casualty documentation for Sergeant Thomas Reyes would be officially corrected, and a federal representative would travel to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and knock on the door of a woman named Elena Reyes, who had spent 3 years arranging her grief into the only shape she could hold. And the conversation that followed would be the hardest kind, the kind that gives back something you'd learned to live without, which requires a different rebuilding than loss does, slower and more complicated and no less real. In 12 weeks, Ferris would call with an answer about the roster position. The answer would be neither yes nor no in the form she'd stated it. It would be a third option, which was the kind of answer that took 12 weeks to build because it required people above Ferris's level to agree that the shape of a position could be determined by the work it needed to do rather than the model it had been built from. She would listen to the full description before saying anything because she'd made a decision in a hospital corridor to stop making agreements that diminished the work, and that decision required patience, not just the willingness to refuse. She would say yes. She would also keep her nursing license current. She would keep her shifts. She would walk into the trauma floor of whatever building she was in, and she would do the work that was directly in front of her, with her hands and her knowledge and the specific set of calculations she'd spent 12 years learning to make. Because the work of keeping people in the world and the work of making the world safer were not different kinds of work. They were the same work at different scales. She'd known that. She'd forgotten it for 3 years. She was done forgetting it. Rex was discharged from Maple Crest General on the same Friday that Mara finished her shift, which was not a coincidence. Hayes had arranged it specifically because Hayes understood that a working dog discharged from a hospital at the beginning of the day framed the day better than one discharged at the end. He walked out through the north exit at 8 in the morning with Hayes on crutches beside him and the collar he'd worn in the field rather than the hospital lead, because that was the collar for the days that mattered. Hayes stopped on the sidewalk outside and looked back at the building and then at Mara, who was standing 6 feet away with her coat and her bag and her third cup of coffee from the nurse's station, which she had taken without asking because it had been a very long 12 hours. "The dog found it first," Hayes said. "Yes." "And then you." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. There were things in the look that were part of the conversation they'd agreed to have later. The Kandahar conversation, the Reyes conversation, the what comes next conversation. And there were things that were simply the expression of a man who had spent 2.5 days in a hospital room and had come out of it with a different understanding of the building he'd been inside than the one he'd arrived with. "You were never invisible," he said. She thought about that. About 3 years of keeping her head down and her station clean and her name off anything that required a second look. About the specific work of making yourself unnoticeable in a place that didn't know what to do with what you actually were. About whether that had been protection or erosion or both, which it had been, both at different points, in proportions that shifted with the season and the shift and the particular quality of whatever she'd been carrying that day. "I was for a while," she said honestly. "That part was real." "And now?" She looked at the building, at the north exit, at the parking structure past the lot where a blue pickup was no longer parked, at the mountains past the interstate, clear-edged in the November light. "Now I'm done with it," she said. Rex sat down on the sidewalk between them with the unhurried dignity of an animal that had done its work and was prepared to wait for whatever came next. He looked up at Mara with the amber eyes that had tracked her the moment she'd walked into room 11, that had been measuring her ever since with the unsentimental accuracy of a trained animal who had no agenda except truth, and he made no sound at all. That was enough. Here's the thing that nobody tells you about the people who get overlooked. They are not overlooked because they are small. They are overlooked because the people doing the overlooking have a limited model of what matters, and the person in front of them doesn't fit the model, so they file them as background and move on. The background is where they stay until the day the model breaks, and the situation requires something the model never prepared for. And then, in the specific crisis of that moment, the person who was background becomes the only foreground that matters. Mara Donovan had spent 3 years being background. She'd chosen it in the beginning. Then she'd gotten comfortable in it. Then she'd started to wonder if background was simply who she was now, which is the particular damage that long invisibility does. It begins to feel like identity rather than posture. It wasn't identity. It was a posture she'd held too long. And the moment a dog pressed flat against a hospital floor and looked at a ventilation panel, the posture broke. What was underneath it had never changed. It had only been waiting, not patiently, not peacefully, but with the quiet, specific readiness of someone who knows what they carry and has been waiting for the day when carrying it is not enough, and using it is what the situation requires. She had used it. The building was still standing. The patients were alive. The people who had built a network inside the systems designed to protect those patients were being dismantled by the weight of their own evidence. And a man who had been a name on a casualty notification for 3 years was in a federal facility somewhere, talking, which was the first version of his name appearing in something official that was actually true. None of it had been clean. None of it had been the version where everything went right and nobody paid any cost. Her jaw was going to need imaging. Reyes had 3 years of a life he couldn't give back. Strom's failure had been real, and its consequences were real. Martinez was 20-something and scared and had been put in a position by people who counted on disposability, which was its own indictment of a system that created it. The world after a crisis does not resolve into neatness. It resolves into the specific next thing that requires attention, which requires you to show up for it the way you showed up for the crisis. Not with the self you wished you were, but with the self you actually are, carrying what you actually have, making the calculations available to you with the information you actually possess. That had always been enough. It would need to keep being enough. She finished her coffee. She put the cup in the recycling bin by the north exit because that was the correct bin for it. She looked at the mountains one more time. Then she walked to her car and drove home and slept and got up the next morning and went back to work.